Hi guys, tonight we find ourselves at the very edge of deep human time, far beyond written records, far beyond cities, even beyond the first settled villages. You arrive in a world that feels almost unfinished, as if the planet itself is still learning how to host people. The air is cold against your skin, carrying the smell of damp earth, smoke, and raw stone. Somewhere nearby, a small fire crackles softly, its orange glow barely pushing back the vast darkness around it. Shadows move at the edge of the light, not clearly threatening, but never fully reassuring either. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you are watching this late at night, feel free to drop a comment with where you are and what time it is for you. It always feels a little grounding to know how far this quiet story travels across the world. Now, dim the lights, and you begin to walk with a small group of early humans through a landscape that feels both familiar and completely alien. The ground is uneven, soft in some places, hard in others, shaped by weather rather than roads. There are no buildings, no streets, no artificial lights, only scattered trees, open stretches of grass, and the slow rhythm of wind moving through everything. From a historical standpoint, scholars generally agree that modern Homo sapiens emerged around 300,000 years ago in Africa, gradually spreading into other regions over tens of thousands of years. Around 100,000 years ago, humans already had relatively advanced cognitive abilities, including symbolic thought and complex tool use, but their lives remained deeply fragile compared to anything we consider stable today. Historians still debate whether early humans at this stage lived in small, highly mobile bands or more loosely connected seasonal groups. Since the archaeological record shows both patterns depending on region and climate. A lesser-known detail that often surprises people is that even at this early stage, humans were not purely focused on survival in the narrow sense. Evidence from cave sites suggests occasional use of pigments and organised living spaces, hinting at early forms of cultural behaviour. Some researchers continue to question whether these behaviours were consistent or rare, bursts of creativity triggered by environmental stress or opportunity. You walk slowly behind the group as they move through tall grass. Every step is careful, not because they're afraid of the ground itself, but because the ground is full of unknowns. A hidden root, a sharp stone, or a sudden dip could easily become a serious injury. And here, in this world, even small injuries matter. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of smoke from a distant fire. That smell alone is almost comforting, like a thread connecting scattered human lives across the landscape. You realize quickly that fire is not just a tool in this world. It is a center of gravity. Without it, night becomes something entirely different, something heavier and less forgiving. And you might wonder how people manage to rest at all in a world like this, where even lying down felt like lowering your guard completely. As you continue, you notice the bodies of the people around you. They are lean, adapted for endurance rather than comfort. Their clothing, if it can be called that, is made of animal hides, loosely shaped and uneven. It moves with them, sometimes sticking to skin damp with sweat or mist. Every material here has a history, but nothing is permanent. Everything is reused, reshaped, repaired again and again until it simply can no longer hold together. A mainstream historical fact is that early human groups relied heavily on mobility, often moving with seasonal changes in food availability rather than staying in fixed locations. This pattern of movement shaped not only survival strategies, but also social organization, forcing humans to maintain strong memory of landscapes rather than relying on constructed maps or permanent markers. You notice this directly as the group pauses near a low rise in the land. One of them scans the horizon quietly, not with urgency, but with practiced attention. There is no written language here, no spoken instructions as we know them. Communication happens through glances, subtle gestures, and a shared understanding built over years of living together. A quirky detail that researchers sometimes highlight is that early humans likely used natural landmarks as memory anchors, such as distinct trees, rock formations, or water bends, effectively turning the landscape itself into a living navigation system. Some scholars remain divided on how sophisticated this mental mapping truly was. Since direct evidence is impossible to reconstruct with certainty, the fire they carry is small, carefully maintained, not a roaring blaze, but a controlled companion. Someone walks beside it, shielding it from wind, ensuring it does not die out, because in this world, losing fire is not an inconvenience. It is a serious rupture in daily life, forcing a group to rebuild not just warmth but security itself. You begin to understand something quietly important here. The hardest part of being human is not a single dramatic challenge. It is the accumulation of constant small demands. Watch the fire, watch the ground, watch the weather, watch each other. There is no moment where attention is fully released. As evening begins to settle, the sky shifts into deeper tones of grey and blue. The group slows, looking for shelter, not a building, but a place that offers slight protection, a rock overhang, a cluster of trees, a natural hollow in the land. Every choice matters, yet none of them feels certain. And as you stand there with them, listening to the wind pass through grass and branches, you realize this is only the beginning of the journey. Not the story of survival as something heroic, but survival as something continuous, quiet, and endlessly demanding. You remain with the group as the last light of day fades, and the world shifts into a softer, more uncertain version of itself. The sky deepens into layers of muted blue and grey, and the temperature begins to fall in a way that is slow but persistent, like the land itself is exhaling. Around you, early humans begin preparing for the night with practiced movements that feel almost silent. There is no ceremony, no structured routine in the modern sense, only repetition shaped by necessity and memory. In this period around 100,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens had already developed flexible survival strategies that allowed them to live across varied environments. From open savannas to forest edges, archaeological evidence suggests the use of simple shelters made from natural materials such as branches, hides, and stone windbreaks. Historians still debate whether these shelters were temporary nightly constructions or semi-permanent seasonal structures reused over time. Since preservation is uneven and often incomplete, a lesser-known detail is that in some sites, clusters of hearths suggest repeated occupation of the same areas, implying that certain locations may have been revisited for generations. This creates the possibility that early humans already had a sense of place attachment, even if it was not expressed in the way modern humans understand home. You kneel near the fire as it's carefully adjusted. The flames are not large, but they are stable, glowing with a steady orange warmth that pushes back the night. Smoke rises slowly and drifts away into the cold air. The smell is sharp, a mixture of burned wood, ash, and something faintly organic that clings to everything. You notice how everyone stays close but not too close, maintaining a balance between warmth and comfort. A mainstream historical fact is that controlled use of fire became a central part of human survival long before this time period, likely hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Fire provided not only warmth and protection, but also a way to process food, extend social interaction into nighttime hours, and deter predators. Some researchers continue to question exactly when humans gained consistent fire control. As evidence varies across regions and archaeological layers, you watch as one individual gently feeds small pieces of wood into the fire, adjusting its shape with careful attention. There is no waste here. Every stick has been collected deliberately. Every resource is considered part of a larger survival equation. Even silence feels intentional, as if sound itself must be conserved. The night air grows colder, and you begin to notice how the human body responds to it with subtle tension. Shoulders rise slightly, hands move closer to the heat, breathing becomes slower, more controlled. In this world, comfort is never guaranteed. It must be created, maintained, and constantly defended against environmental pressure. A quirky detail often mentioned by researchers is that some early fire sites show evidence of repeated ash layers, suggesting that groups return to the same hearth locations again and again. This has led some scholars to suggest that fire sites may have functioned as early social anchors, not just physical tools but emotional centres where groups naturally gathered. Other scholars remain cautious, arguing that repeated use could simply reflect convenience rather than symbolic meaning. You begin to see how night changes everything. During the day, movement defines life. At night, stillness becomes survival. The group settles into resting positions, some sitting, others lying against the ground or against each other for warmth. The earth beneath you holds the day's remaining heat, slowly releasing it into the cooling air. Beyond the firelight, the landscape disappears into darkness, not a darkness filled with detail, but a complete absence of form. This is not a world lit by distant street lamps or reflected glow. It is a world where light exists only where it is actively maintained. Everything else is unknown. You hear distant sounds, subtle and irregular, the rustle of grass, the shifting of branches, the occasional call of an animal that cannot be seen. Each sound carries weight because it is not separated from its source by artificial distance. It feels immediate, even when it is far away. A mainstream historical fact is that early human groups likely faced significant nocturnal predation risk, with large carnivores occupying many of the same habitats. While direct evidence of specific encounters is rare, fossil records and predator distributions suggest that humans had to remain highly alert during nighttime hours, especially in open environments. Historians still debate whether fear of nighttime was primarily driven by actual predator frequency or by psychological amplification of limited sensory information in darkness. Some researchers suggest that human sensitivity to sound and movement in low-light conditions may have shaped deep cognitive patterns related to vigilance and social bonding. You notice how the group subtly adjusts itself as the night deepens. Individuals move closer together, forming a loose cluster around the fire. This arrangement is not formally discussed, yet it happens consistently. It provides warmth, protection, and perhaps something less tangible, a sense of shared presence against the unknown. A quirky detail sometimes noted in anthropological studies is that early humans may have used rhythmic vocalizations or soft repetitive sounds during nighttime gatherings. While not confirmed, some researchers propose that these could have served as early forms of social reassurance or coordination, long before structured language or music as we recognize it today. The fire shifts again, collapsing slightly inward as wood is consumed. Sparks rise briefly and disappear into the darkness above. You find yourself watching these small movements, as if they carry meaning beyond their physical form. In a world like this, even small changes in fire behavior could signal time passing, fuel running low, or the need for adjustment. As you sit with them longer, you begin to feel the rhythm of this life. It is not fast, not dramatic, but continuous. Every moment requires attention. Every comfort is temporary, and yet there is something steady in the way the group remains together, as if collective presence is the only reliable structure they have. And slowly, the night deepens further, wrapping everything in a quiet that is both protective and uncertain. The fire from earlier has settled into a lower, quieter state, its flames no longer reaching upward in lively bursts, but instead folding into glowing embers that pulse gently like a slow-breathing organism around it. The group shifts again as the night deepens. What was once a loose gathering becomes something tighter, more deliberate. You feel it immediately. The air is colder now. Not dramatically, but enough that every exposed part of the body begins to register discomfort in small, persistent ways. The problem here is not just cold, it is sustained cold. A kind of environmental pressure that does not leave after a moment but accumulates slowly over time. For early humans around 100,000 years ago, maintaining body heat was one of the most constant biological challenges. Archaeological and physiological studies suggest that Homo sapiens had already adapted to a wide range of climates, but thermoregulation still placed significant demands on energy, behavior, and social cooperation. Historians still debate whether early humans in colder regions relied more heavily on behavioral adaptation, or whether biological acclimatization played a stronger role over generations. You pull your attention back to the group as they begin layering themselves against the cold. Animal hides are drawn tighter around shoulders and legs. Some individuals curl slightly inward, conserving heat by reducing exposed surface area. Others position themselves close enough to share warmth, but carefully avoid disturbing the fragile balance of sleep and vigilance. A mainstream historical fact is that clothing made from animal hides, likely shaped using stone tools and simple scraping techniques, became an essential adaptation for survival in colder environments long before the rise of agriculture. This development allowed early humans to expand into regions that would otherwise have been too harsh for sustained habitation. Even simple garments represented a major shift in how humans interacted with their environment, effectively extending the body's natural limits. You notice how clothing here is not fashion or identity in any modern sense. It is protection and nothing more. A piece of hide is valuable not because of how it looks, but because of how well it holds warmth close to the skin. Every tear matters, every patch is reused material, stitched or tied with sinew when possible. Nothing is discarded easily. A quirky detail often mentioned by researchers is that some early sewing tools, likely made from bone or antler, show signs of repeated use wear patterns that suggest careful, repetitive stitching motions. This implies not only practical clothing repair, but also a degree of patience and skill that may have been passed down through informal teaching rather than structured instruction. Some scholars continue to question whether such tool specialization appeared gradually or emerged more rapidly in certain populations due to environmental pressure. The wind shifts again, and you feel it slip through gaps in clothing and shelter. There is no true barrier here in the modern sense, no sealed walls, no insulated rooms, only layers, positioning, and fire. Someone moves a flat piece of wood or stone slightly to block the wind direction. Adjusting a simple windbreak, it is not perfect, but it reduces exposure enough to matter. You begin to understand that staying warm is not a single action. It is a continuous set of small decisions. Where to sit, how to fold your body, how close to move to others, how to manage firewood, even how long to remain still versus moving to generate heat through motion. Every choice is part of a larger equation of survival. A mainstream historical fact is that energy expenditure and caloric intake were tightly linked in early human societies, especially in colder environments. Maintaining body temperature required significant metabolic energy, which meant that food acquisition was not just about hunger, but about sustaining core physiological stability. Without sufficient caloric intake, the body's ability to resist cold would rapidly decline. You notice the subtle sounds around you, a shift of hides, a soft exhale, the faint crackle of ember collapse. Even breathing feels slightly louder in the cold air, as if the environment itself is amplifying internal awareness. Sleep here is not a clean separation from waking life. It is a fragile negotiation with danger and discomfort. A quirky detail that some anthropological studies highlight is that early human sleeping arrangements often show evidence of repeated communal clustering, suggesting that people may have preferred group sleeping not only for protection, but also for shared warmth. Some researchers even propose that this behaviour could have influenced long-term social bonding mechanisms, though others remain cautious about drawing psychological conclusions from spatial patterns alone. You shift slightly closer to the group. The warmth is subtle but noticeable, like a faint current passing between bodies. This shared heat is one of the few reliable comforts in this environment. It is not permanent. It is not guaranteed. But it is real in this moment. The fire continues to shrink, its light dimming but still present. Someone occasionally adds small pieces of wood, careful not to let it flare too brightly, which would waste fuel or attract unwanted attention. Firewood is not abundant. It must be gathered during daylight, carried back, and conserved in some regions. Archaeological evidence suggests that maintaining fire across nights may have been a highly valued skill, with certain individuals possibly taking responsibility for its care. Historians still debate whether fire management was a shared communal duty, or whether early social structures already assigned specialized roles. You feel the rhythm of the night slowly settle deeper. The cold does not disappear, but it becomes something you adjust to rather than resist directly. This is one of the quiet truths of this world. Comfort is not achieved by eliminating discomfort, but by learning how to coexist with it. Beyond the immediate circle of firelight, the darkness feels complete, not empty, but full in a way that cannot be seen. The sounds of distant movement continue, faint and irregular, a branch shifting under weight, a call that fades quickly into silence. The group responds not with panic, but with practiced awareness. There is no need for constant reaction, only readiness. A mainstream historical fact is that early human survival depended heavily on group cooperation, particularly in managing environmental stresses such as cold, hunger, and predation risk. Isolation significantly reduced survival probability, while group cohesion increased access to shared resources and collective vigilance. You notice how this cooperation is not spoken about directly. It exists in positioning, in shared routines, in unspoken timing. Someone adjusts their body slightly to shield another from wind. Someone else moves closer to the fire to make space. These are not dramatic gestures. They are quiet, almost invisible acts that accumulate into survival itself. A quirky detail often discussed in research is that repeated hearth-centered living may have influenced early spatial organization of human groups, with fire acting as a central reference point around which movement and rest were structured. Some scholars continue to debate whether this represents early social planning or simply natural convergence of behavior around warmth and light. As the night progresses, your awareness begins to slow slightly, not into sleep, but into a more relaxed observation. The cold is still present, but it no longer feels like a sudden intrusion. It has become part of the background of existence here, like wind in trees or the steady presence of earth beneath bodies, and in that quiet, you begin to sense something important. The hardest part of staying warm is not the cold itself, it is the constant requirement to remain engaged with it, to never fully forget it, even for a moment. The embers glow a little softer now, and the group remains together, steady in the dimming night. The night from earlier has not truly ended. It simply shifts into a quieter phase, where the fire becomes a faint pulse of orange light, and the world beyond it feels even more distant. You are still with the same group, still moving through the same fragile rhythm of survival. But now another presence begins to take shape in your awareness. It is not cold this time, it is hunger. It arrives slowly, almost politely at first, like a reminder you could ignore if you were in a different world. But here, in this time, it does not fade. It settles into the body and stays there, a hollow, low sensation beneath the ribs that grows more noticeable with every passing hour. You realize that hunger is not an interruption to life. It is part of its background noise. From a historical standpoint, early Homo sapiens around 100,000 years ago lived as hunter-gatherers, relying on a combination of foraging, scavenging, and opportunistic hunting. Archaeological evidence from stone tools, animal bones, and plant residues suggests a highly varied diet depending on region and season. Historians still debate whether early humans were primarily cooperative hunters or more often individual foragers who shared resources after acquisition. Since both patterns appear in different site interpretations, you shift slightly closer to the fire as your attention drifts across the group. Some are sleeping lightly, others remain awake, staring into the dim glow. There is no clear division between day and night labour here. Food acquisition defines time more than the sun does, and yet, even in rest, the body is always aware of its needs. A mainstream historical fact is that early human survival depended heavily on unpredictable food sources. Unlike later agricultural societies, there was no stored surplus to rely on during scarcity. Seasonal changes could dramatically affect availability of plants, game, and edible roots. This meant that periods of abundance were often followed by periods of uncertainty, shaping both behaviour and migration patterns. You notice how food is never spoken of in abstract terms here. It is always immediate, a smell carried on wind, a remembered location of fruit, a track in the soil that might lead to something edible. Even the memory of food carries weight, almost physical in its intensity. A quirky detail often mentioned by researchers is that some prehistoric sites show evidence of repeated consumption of nutrient-rich bone marrow, suggesting that early humans not only hunted animals, but also carefully extracted maximum nutritional value from every available resource. Some scholars remain divided on how organised this process was, with debates focusing on whether marrow extraction was systematic planning or opportunistic behaviour driven by immediate need. The fire flicker again, and for a moment, you see hands moving near it. Someone is handling a small piece of food, possibly dried meat or a preserved portion of something gathered earlier. There is no clear sense of meal times here. Eating happens when food exists, not when time dictates it. The act is slow, deliberate, almost reverent in its simplicity. You begin to understand that hunger in this world is not just physical, it is psychological as well. It shapes attention, movement, even memory. Every decision is influenced by the question of whether food might be found, preserved, or shared. And unlike modern experiences where hunger is often temporary and predictable, here it is uncertain and persistent. A mainstream historical fact is that early human groups likely practiced broad-spectrum foraging strategies, meaning they consumed a wide range of available foods rather than specializing in a single resource. This adaptability allowed them to survive in diverse environments, but also required extensive ecological knowledge passed through observation and shared experience. You follow the group in your mind as they move through this landscape during daylight hours. You imagine them scanning riverbanks for shellfish, digging for roots, collecting berries when in season, and tracking animals across uneven terrain. Every activity requires energy, yet energy itself depends on success. It is a constant balance that never fully stabilizes, and you might wonder how it felt to plan a future when the present was never guaranteed. A quirky detail that researchers sometimes highlight is that early human teeth show a surprising degree of wear patterns, indicating a mixed diet of tough plant material and processed food. Some scholars suggest that this wear may reflect not only diet, but also the use of teeth as tools for processing materials such as fibres or hides. though others argue that dietary abrasion alone could explain the patterns. You shift again, noticing how even the idea of comfort feels different here. Fullness is rare. Satiation is temporary. The body is always either preparing for food, searching for food, or recovering from the absence of food. Hunger is not dramatic. It is constant, like background weather inside the body. The group around you remains quiet. Occasionally, someone adjusts position, as if conserving energy even in sleep. Energy here is not abstract. It is measured in movement, warmth, and survival itself. Every unnecessary action carries cost. A mainstream historical fact is that cooperative sharing of food likely played a crucial role in early human survival. Evidence from archaeological sites suggests that larger animal kills were often distributed among group members, indicating social structures that supported sharing and reciprocity. Historians still debate whether this sharing was based on equality or hierarchy, with some interpretations suggesting more structured access depending on status or contribution. You begin to notice subtle dynamics within the group. Who sits closer to the fire? Who receives food first? Who remains awake longer? These patterns are not spoken aloud, but they exist in the arrangement of bodies and attention. Hunger makes these structures more visible, because scarcity always sharpens organization. The night air shifts slightly, carrying distant movement from the dark landscape beyond. You cannot see what it is, but the group reacts only minimally. Hunger and fear exist side by side here. But neither dominates completely. They are both part of the same environmental reality. A quirky detail often discussed in anthropological studies is that some early human groups appear to have returned repeatedly to specific locations where resources were seasonally reliable, effectively creating early ecological maps based on memory rather than written record. Some scholars continue to debate how precise this environmental memory could have been across generations without formal documentation. You sit with this thought as the fire dims again. Hunger does not disappear, but it becomes familiar enough that it no longer demands constant attention. Instead, it integrates into the rhythm of the night, like cold or wind or silence, and slowly. You realize something subtle but important. The hardest part of hunger is not the absence of food itself. It is the uncertainty of when it will end. The embers glow faintly, and the group remains together in quiet endurance. The fire has now settled into a thin, glowing line of embers, barely holding its shape against the expanding dark. The group around you has shifted again, not because anything has changed dramatically, but because time itself is doing what it always does here. It presses forward slowly, and every hour requires a different kind of endurance. You are still within the same night, still within the same fragile circle of survival. But now a new kind of strain begins to reveal itself. It is not cold, it is not hunger, it is distance. The simple act of moving through space becomes one of the greatest challenges of being human 100,000 years ago. From a historical perspective, early Homo sapiens were highly mobile foragers. Archaeological evidence from stone tool distributions and animal remains suggests that groups often travelled long distances across varied landscapes to follow seasonal resources. Historians still debate whether these movements were strictly seasonal migrations or more flexible patterns of opportunistic roaming, influenced by environmental change and social interaction. You imagine what it means to walk through this world without roads, without maps, without any permanent markers of direction beyond memory and landscape features. Every journey is committed to the mind. Every return depends on recall, shared stories, and subtle environmental cues. A mainstream historical fact is that early human navigation relied heavily on environmental literacy. Landmarks such as river bends, rock formations, tree clusters, and changes in terrain were essential for orientation. Unlike modern GPS-based navigation, survival depended on building a mental map through repeated exposure and careful attention to detail over time. You begin to feel this now as the group prepares to move before dawn. There is no announcement, no structured departure. Instead, bodies simply begin to adjust, gathering belongings, tightening hides, checking the fire one last time. Movement is quiet because sound carries risk in a world where unknown dangers may still be present in the dark. A quirky detail often noted by researchers is that some prehistoric sites show evidence of tool caches left in specific locations, suggesting that early humans may have used informal storage points during seasonal movement. Some scholars continue to debate whether this indicates planned logistical behavior or simply opportunistic reuse of familiar spaces. As the group begins to walk, you notice how carefully they move through terrain that is still partially hidden by darkness. The ground is uneven, shaped by natural forces rather than human engineering. Small dips, hidden roots, and rocky patches require constant adjustment. Every step carries a small decision. You start to understand that movement here is never automatic. It is always attentive. Even walking requires awareness. The fire fades behind you, becoming a distant point of orange that slowly disappears into blackness, and with it goes the only stable reference point of the night. Without it, the world expands again into uncertainty. A mainstream historical fact is that early human groups likely travelled in relatively small bands, often between 20 and 50 individuals, although exact numbers varied by region and ecological conditions. These group sizes balanced the need for cooperation with the limitations of available food resources. Historians still debate whether group size was primarily determined by environmental constraints or by social bonding capacities that limited cohesion beyond certain thresholds. You walk alongside them now, feeling the rhythm of movement across unfamiliar ground. The air is cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of vegetation and distant water. Somewhere ahead, the sky begins to lighten slightly, but not yet enough to change the landscape. In this transitional moment between night and day, you notice something subtle. Fatigue is always present, but it is not evenly distributed. Some members of the group move with steady endurance, while others show signs of strain. Energy management is not abstract here. It is visible in posture, in pace, in the quiet decisions about when to rest or continue. A quirky detail that researchers sometimes mention is that skeletal remains from this period show variation in muscle development, consistent with highly active lifestyles involving long-distance walking and intermittent bursts of physical exertion. Some scholars remain divided on whether this indicates daily mobility or episodic long-range migration events. You continue walking, and the landscape begins to open slightly. The darkness is thinning, revealing outlines of low vegetation and uneven terrain. The world is returning slowly, piece by piece, as if it is being redrawn by light. You begin to realize how deeply survival is tied to movement. Staying in one place for too long risks resource depletion. Moving too far risks exhaustion or danger. Every decision exists between these two pressures. A mainstream historical fact is that early human survival strategies were highly flexible, often combining short-term foraging with longer-distance exploratory movement. This adaptability allowed Homo sapiens to occupy a wide range of ecological zones, from coastal environments to inland forests and grasslands. As the group moves, you notice how communication remains minimal, a glance, a subtle shift in direction, a pause at a particular point in the ground. These signals replace structured language. Understanding is shared rather than explained, and you might wonder how much of human intelligence was shaped not by thinking alone, but by the need to coordinate movement without losing cohesion. A quirky detail often discussed in anthropological research is that early humans may have used rhythmic walking patterns or synchronized movement as a way to maintain group unity during long journeys. Some scholars continue to debate whether this reflects intentional coordination or emergent behavior arising naturally from shared pacing and terrain constraints. The sky continues to brighten slowly. Shadows become less absolute. Gaining texture and depth, the world begins to regain its shape. You can now see further ahead, noticing subtle changes in elevation and vegetation. You realize that distance itself is not just physical here. It is cognitive. It requires memory, anticipation, and trust in others. No one can hold the entire landscape alone. It is always distributed across the group. A mainstream historical fact is that early human cognition likely evolved in close relationship with spatial awareness and group coordination. The ability to remember locations, track resources, and anticipate environmental changes would have provided significant survival advantages. You feel this in the way the group pauses briefly at a ridge, scanning the land ahead. There is no map, no written plan, only shared understanding built through experience. After a moment, they continue. As if a silent agreement has been reached, the wind shifts slightly, carrying cooler air from an open area ahead. You sense that the night is ending, but the difficulty of survival is not. It simply changes form, and in this quiet transition, you begin to understand something fundamental. The hardest part of being human here is not a single condition like cold or hunger or fear. It is the constant need to move through uncertainty without ever fully escaping it. The group continues forward into the pale edge of morning light. The pale edge of morning slowly spreads across the landscape, not as a sudden arrival but as a gradual revealing. Shapes that were once hidden in darkness begin to take form again. Low shrubs, uneven ground, distant tree lines. Everything returns as if it has been waiting quietly for permission to exist. The group continues moving, their pace steady but unhurried. No one speaks. Communication here is built into movement itself. A slight change in direction, a pause near a patch of ground, a glance toward the horizon. You start to realize that language, in this world, is not separate from survival. It is embedded inside action. From archaeological findings across Africa and Eurasia, early Homo sapiens at this stage already demonstrated strong environmental awareness. One line of evidence suggests that their survival depended heavily on the ability to interpret subtle ecological signals such as soil texture, animal movement patterns, and seasonal vegetation changes. Some researchers propose that this form of attention may have been more developed than anything seen in later sedentary societies. You step carefully as the ground becomes more visible. Small stones shift underfoot. Dry grass brushes against your legs. The air is cooler now, carrying the scent of damp earth mixed with something faintly organic, like decaying leaves and smoke residue from distant fires. A lesser-known observation from archaeological site analysis is that early human camps often show layered debris patterns, suggesting repeated short-term occupation rather than permanent settlement. This indicates a lifestyle built around movement and return, rather than fixed residence. Some anthropologists interpret this as a highly adaptive strategy, while others suggest it reflects environmental necessity rather than choice. You notice the group pausing near a slight rise in the land. Everyone becomes still for a moment, not tense, but attentive. The posture is familiar now. It is the posture of listening to a landscape that does not speak in words but in signs. Somewhere in the distance, a faint movement of birds breaks the silence. It is small, almost insignificant, yet it changes the atmosphere. The world feels more awake now, more active. You can sense that the night's vulnerability is fading, but not completely gone. The group begins to move again, adjusting their direction slightly. You realize there is no single path here, only routes remembered, corrected, refined through experience. Every step is a negotiation with terrain that does not care whether you succeed or fail. A body of research in evolutionary anthropology highlights how early humans likely relied on multisensory integration for survival. Sight, hearing, smell, and even subtle vibrations in the ground may have contributed to decision-making. This heightened sensory awareness is thought to be a key factor in human adaptability across diverse environments. As you walk, you notice how fatigue from the night still lingers. It is not overwhelming, but it sits in the muscles like a quiet weight. Yet the group continues without complaint. There is no separation between exhaustion and necessity here. They are the same condition. A small detail often mentioned in field studies of prehistoric tool sites is that stone tools show signs of repeated reshaping over time, rather than discarding worn tools. Early humans frequently modified them for new purposes. This suggests a mindset of conservation, where objects were extended in usefulness far beyond their original form. You glance at the hands of one individual walking nearby. They are rough, marked by small cuts and healed scars. These are not injuries in the modern sense of emergency. They are part of daily existence. The body itself becomes a record of survival. The landscape begins to open slightly. You see a broader stretch of terrain ahead, where the vegetation thins and the ground flattens. It feels like transition space, neither forest nor open plain. These in-between zones were often important for early humans, according to archaeological distribution patterns, because they offered mixed resources within a single area. You can almost feel the group recalibrating internally. There is no spoken instruction, but the pace shifts subtly. Attention spreads outward. Eyes scan more frequently. This is not fear, it is habit. Survival here depends on constant, low-level awareness. One interpretation in paleoanthropology suggests that early human cognition was shaped by what some researchers call distributed attention, meaning that no single individual needed to perceive everything. Instead, awareness was shared across the group, forming a collective understanding of the environment. Other scholars argue that this interpretation risks overstating social cohesion, pointing instead to individual variation in perception and decision-making. You notice how easily both interpretations could be true at different moments. The sun rises further now, warming the upper layers of the air. Light spreads unevenly across the ground, highlighting textures that were invisible before: small depressions, animal tracks, scattered vegetation patterns. The world becomes more readable, but also more complex. The group stops briefly near a shallow water source. Not a river, but a small collection of pooled water between stones. Everyone is careful as they approach. Water here is not assumed to be safe or abundant. It is assessed, observed, tested indirectly through behavior and context. A common finding in archaeological hydrology studies is that early human groups often organized movement routes around seasonal water availability. These water points acted as anchors in otherwise unpredictable landscapes, shaping migration patterns over long periods of time. You watch as someone kneels, observing the water without rushing. There is no certainty here, only evaluation. The act of drinking is never casual. It is part of a larger calculation of risk and necessity. A small detail sometimes noted in research is that isotopic analysis of ancient human remains suggests variation in water sources over time, indicating mobility across different ecological zones. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of wide-ranging movement, while others suggest more localized but frequent shifts in resource use. You stand quietly as the group rests for a moment. The morning light now feels more stable, less uncertain. But nothing here becomes fully safe. It only becomes temporarily readable. You begin to understand that the hardest challenge is not any single environmental condition. It is the need to constantly interpret a world that never becomes fully familiar. Every moment requires attention. Every change requires adjustment. Nothing remains fixed long enough to become fully known. And yet the group continues. moving forward into a landscape that is slowly becoming day. The morning light strengthens as the group leaves the shallow water behind, and the landscape begins to feel less like a threat and more like a vast field of possibilities that still must be carefully read. Everything is clearer now, but clarity does not mean safety. It only means that danger is easier to notice. You walk with them across uneven ground that stretches outward without roads, fences, or boundaries. The sky is open in a way that feels almost heavy, as if its vastness itself is part of the survival challenge. Every direction looks similar at first, but the group never seems uncertain. Their movements suggest a shared internal map built from years of experience rather than any fixed reference. Archaeological evidence from multiple early Homo sapiens sites indicates that mobility patterns were often tied to seasonal resource distribution and animal migration routes. One interpretation in paleoanthropological research suggests that this required extremely detailed environmental memory, where individuals could recall water sources, shelter locations, and hunting grounds across large territories. Some researchers propose that this cognitive mapping ability may have been one of the defining traits that allowed humans to expand across continents. You notice how the group spreads slightly as they move, not breaking apart but adjusting spacing according to terrain and visibility. No one is too far, but no one is tightly packed either. It feels like a balance between independence and cohesion, constantly maintained without words. A subtle but important observation in archaeological studies is that stone tool scatters found across open landscapes often show repeated patterns of short-term activity, suggesting that early humans did not simply travel randomly, but followed structured movement circuits. Some anthropologists argue that these patterns reflect deliberate planning, while others suggest they emerge naturally from following resources rather than designing routes. The air warms gradually as the sun rises higher. You feel it on your skin, a soft pressure replacing the cold of the night. Yet even this comfort is temporary. Everyone in the group remains aware of the need to find food before the day becomes too demanding. You begin to notice small behavioral shifts. Heads tilt slightly toward the ground. Eyes scan vegetation more frequently. Steps slow in certain areas where edible plants might be present. There is no spoken agreement, but attention becomes collectively focused. One widely discussed finding in paleoecology is that early human diets were highly flexible, often incorporating a wide range of plant species, insects, small animals, and scavenged remains. This dietary flexibility is thought to have been a crucial survival advantage in unstable environments. Some researchers emphasize its importance in allowing humans to adapt to climate fluctuations during the Pleistocene period. You crouch slightly as the group pauses near a patch of vegetation. Someone reaches down, inspecting leaves carefully. There is no rush. Selection is slow and deliberate. Not everything green is safe. And knowledge of what can be eaten is accumulated through experience rather than assumption. A lesser-known detail from ethnographic comparisons with later hunter-gatherer societies is that food knowledge is often distributed unevenly within groups. Certain individuals specialize in plant identification, others in tracking animals, and others in tool preparation. Some scholars suggest that this division of expertise may have early origins in prehistoric groups, though direct evidence remains debated. You continue moving after a short pause, following the group deeper into a gently sloping area. The terrain shifts subtly here. The soil becomes softer, and scattered stones appear more frequently. The environment feels like a transition zone where different ecological regions overlap. These transition zones are often highlighted in archaeological models as highly productive areas for early human activity, because they offer multiple resource types within a single accessible space. However, some researchers caution that such zones may also increase exposure to predators due to reduced cover. As you walk, you notice how sound behaves differently in daylight. it is less enclosed than at night, more dispersed. Bird calls, distant rustling, occasional footfalls of small animals, everything feels present but not concentrated. The group suddenly slows again, not in alarm, but in attention. You follow their gaze and notice faint movement ahead. It is not clearly defined at first, just a shift in vegetation, a subtle interruption in stillness. Early human survival often depended on interpreting such subtle environmental cues. One line of archaeological interpretation suggests that heightened sensitivity to movement and pattern disruption was essential for detecting both prey and potential danger. Some researchers argue that this level of perceptual awareness may have shaped aspects of human visual cognition still present today. The group does not rush forward. Instead, they adjust their spacing again, becoming slightly more cautious. You feel the atmosphere tighten, not with fear, but with concentration, after a moment. The movement ahead resolves into small animals passing through the vegetation. Nothing dramatic, just life continuing independently of the group. The tension dissolves slowly, replaced by quiet observation. You realize how much of this world is defined by constant interpretation. Nothing is ever neutral. Every sound, every movement, every shift in light must be evaluated. There is no passive experience of nature here, only active reading of it. A small but significant archaeological insight comes from wear patterns on hunting tools, which suggest repeated use in controlled, targeted motions rather than chaotic or random strikes. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of planned hunting strategies, while others suggest that hunting may have been opportunistic rather than coordinated. You continue walking, feeling the rhythm of movement settle again. The group resumes its steady pace, scanning the land without breaking formation. You begin to sense that survival here is not about reacting to crisis, but about preventing crisis through constant awareness. The sun climbs higher, and shadows shorten. Heat begins to accumulate slowly, changing the texture of the air. You notice how everyone subtly adjusts, moving into slightly shaded areas when available, conserving energy by avoiding unnecessary exposure. In evolutionary anthropology, there is ongoing discussion about how thermoregulation, endurance walking, and cognitive mapping may have co-evolved in early Homo sapiens. Some researchers propose that long-distance walking under variable conditions was not just a survival behavior, but a shaping force in human physiology and cognition. Others remain cautious, emphasizing that multiple factors likely contributed. You feel this complexity in the simple act of walking. It is not just movement, it is coordination, memory, perception, and adaptation happening simultaneously. The group eventually reaches a slightly elevated area, where the view opens across a wide stretch of land. From here, the landscape feels both immense and organized in subtle ways. Water lines, vegetation clusters, animal paths. Everything is interconnected if you know how to look. You stand there with them for a moment, taking in the quiet stability of morning. There is no certainty about what comes next, only the continuation of movement, attention, and shared effort. And as you observe this world unfolding under daylight, you begin to understand that the hardest part of being human here is not any single challenge, but the endless requirement to stay aware inside a world that never stops changing. The group begins to move again, disappearing slowly into the open land. The group moves down from the elevated ground, and the landscape slowly shifts again, becoming more textured, more layered, as if the earth itself is offering both opportunity and difficulty in equal measure. The morning light is now fully present, warm but not harsh, casting long, soft shadows that stretch across uneven terrain. You feel how the world changes with light, how visibility reshapes behavior, and how even the same ground feels different once it is fully revealed. You walk among them as they descend into a broader valley area where vegetation thickens slightly and scattered water traces appear in shallow depressions. This is not a fixed settlement. It is a living space in motion, shaped by seasons, weather, and memory. Early Homo sapiens around 100,000 years ago often lived within such shifting landscapes, where survival depended on following resources rather than controlling them. Archaeological patterns from this period show that groups frequently returned to familiar regions across generations, even if they did not occupy a single site permanently. One interpretation in paleoanthropology suggests that these repeated movements created a kind of cognitive landscape, where memory and environment were deeply intertwined. Some researchers argue that this may represent the early foundation of what we now understand as territorial awareness, while others emphasize its fluid and non-exclusive nature. You notice the group beginning to spread slightly as they move into this more resource-rich area. The tension of tight formation relaxes, but not completely. There is still awareness in every direction. The body posture changes subtly as attention shifts from navigation to searching. A widely supported finding in prehistoric dietary studies is that early humans were highly opportunistic feeders, consuming whatever was available within their ecological range. This included plant tubers, fruits, seeds, insects, small animals, and occasionally scavenged remains from larger predators. This broad diet is considered one of the key adaptive advantages that allowed Homo sapiens to survive across diverse environments. You crouch briefly as someone examines the ground. There are faint signs here, marks that might indicate animal movement, not obvious trails, but subtle disturbances in soil and vegetation. Nothing is confirmed, only interpreted. The world here does not give clear answers. It offers clues that must be assembled into meaning. A lesser-known observation from ethnographic comparisons is that foraging knowledge in traditional societies is often highly detailed and localized, with individuals learning specific microenvironments over years. Some anthropologists suggest that similar knowledge systems may have existed in prehistoric groups. Though direct archaeological evidence remains indirect and open to interpretation, you begin to understand that attention here is not general, it is specific. Every individual reads the environment slightly differently, and together these perspectives form a shared understanding of the landscape. The group continues moving, occasionally stopping to inspect vegetation or ground patterns. There is no urgency, but there is no relaxation either. The rhythm of movement is steady, shaped by both caution and expectation. As the terrain shifts again, you notice a subtle increase in animal activity. Small movements in grass, distant calls. The presence of life that is not human becomes more noticeable. This is often where opportunity exists, but also where unpredictability increases. In evolutionary research, there is ongoing discussion about how early humans balanced risk and reward in foraging decisions. One perspective suggests that cognitive flexibility, the ability to switch between strategies depending on environmental conditions, was a crucial survival trait. Other researchers emphasize the role of learned cultural practices passed through observation and imitation. You feel this flexibility in the group's behavior. They do not commit to one path or one goal. Instead, they adjust continuously, responding to subtle environmental cues as they appear. A mainstream archaeological finding is that early human stone tools show remarkable variation depending on region and function, indicating that tool-making was adapted to specific ecological contexts. Some tools appear specialized for cutting plant material, others for processing animal tissue, and others for woodworking tasks. This suggests a level of technical adaptation that was highly responsive to environmental demands. You notice a moment where the group pauses again, this time longer. Someone kneels near a cluster of plants, carefully examining leaves and stems. There is no immediate action, only observation. Selection in this world is not fast. It is deliberate. cautious, and informed by accumulated knowledge. A small but interesting detail often discussed in archaeological literature is that certain plant processing sites show traces of repeated use over long periods, suggesting that early humans may have returned to specific locations known for reliable food sources. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of proto-seasonal planning, while others caution that it may simply reflect environmental clustering of resources. You watch as a few items are gathered and placed into simple carrying bundles. There is no separation between work and travel. Everything is integrated. Even walking becomes a form of searching. The sun rises higher now, and warmth becomes more noticeable. It is not uncomfortable yet. But it changes behaviour. Movements become slightly slower in exposed areas. The group naturally seeks partial shade when possible, adjusting without discussion. Anthropological studies often highlight how thermoregulation and energy efficiency influenced early human movement patterns. Long-distance walking under variable temperatures required careful balancing of effort, rest, and hydration. Some researchers propose that this may have contributed to the development of endurance-based physiology, unique among primates. You feel this endurance in the steady pace of the group. It is not fast, but it is consistent. There is no wasted movement. Every step serves a purpose, even if that purpose is simply continuation. As you move further, the landscape opens again into a wider stretch of mixed terrain. Here, visibility increases, but so does exposure. The group becomes more alert, spacing themselves slightly differently. Attention spreads outward in all directions. In paleoanthropological interpretations, this kind of open terrain is often associated with increased reliance on group coordination. While there is debate about the exact nature of early social organization, many researchers agree that collective vigilance likely played a significant role in survival, especially in areas where predators or competing groups might appear. You notice how quickly awareness shifts when the environment changes. There is no verbal instruction. The group simply adjusts. It feels almost instinctive, but it is likely the result of long-learned experience passed through observation and shared history. A lesser-known detail from archaeological site distribution studies is that early human occupation sites often cluster near ecological boundaries, such as where forest meets grassland or where river systems intersect. These boundary zones tend to offer diverse resources within a relatively small area, making them highly valuable for mobile foraging groups. You begin to see the logic of movement more clearly now. It is not random wandering. It is structured responsiveness to environmental gradients. The group slows briefly near another shallow depression in the land. Water may be present here depending on recent rainfall. The soil is slightly darker, suggesting retained moisture. Someone steps forward to investigate carefully. There is no rush. Water is life here, but it is also uncertain. It must be confirmed, not assumed. And as you stand with them in this quiet moment of evaluation, you begin to understand something deeper. The hardest part of being human here is not simply finding resources. It is constantly interpreting whether resources are truly there at all. The group remains still for a moment longer, then begins to move again across the open land. The group leaves the shallow depression behind, continuing forward into a landscape that feels increasingly open, as if the earth itself is slowly widening its breadth. The morning has now fully matured into late morning light, and everything is clearer, sharper, more defined. Yet clarity does not reduce difficulty. It only makes every detail more visible, every decision more informed, and every risk more immediate. You walk among them as they move across gently rolling terrain where vegetation becomes patchier, and the soil shifts between firm ground and softer patches that retain moisture. This is a transitional ecological zone, neither fully forest nor fully grassland, and such areas are often considered highly valuable in archaeological interpretations. because they provide diverse resources within a compact space. One line of anthropological research suggests that early human groups may have preferentially occupied these zones due to their ecological richness, while others argue that mobility patterns were driven more by animal migration than by deliberate selection. You notice that the group's attention has subtly changed again. It is less about navigation now and more about awareness of life around them. Heads turn slightly more often, steps slow in irregular intervals. There is a sense that the environment is being actively read rather than passively crossed. A widely accepted finding in paleoanthropology is that early Homo sapiens were highly adaptable foragers whose survival depended on flexible dietary strategies and deep environmental knowledge. Evidence from isotopic analysis of fossil remains suggests varied diets across regions, indicating that groups adjusted their food sources based on local availability rather than relying on a fixed subsistence pattern. You crouch briefly as someone inspects a cluster of disturbed soil. There are faint signs of movement here, possibly small animals or insects recently active. Nothing is certain. Interpretation is always probabilistic. The ground does not provide answers, only traces. A lesser-known detail in archaeological site studies is that some locations show repeated short-term occupation layers separated by long gaps, suggesting that early humans may have returned to specific areas seasonally or opportunistically over many generations. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of long-term landscape familiarity, while others suggest it reflects natural clustering of resources rather than intentional planning. You continue walking, feeling how the group maintains cohesion without rigid structure. No one leads in an obvious sense. Instead, direction emerges collectively through subtle adjustments. A change in pace here, a pause there, a shift in attention that others instinctively follow. The sun is higher now, and warmth becomes more pronounced. It presses gently against exposed skin, changing how the body feels in motion. You notice how the group instinctively seeks partial cover when available, moving through patches of shade cast by uneven terrain or scattered vegetation. One important observation in evolutionary anthropology is that endurance walking combined with heat regulation may have played a significant role in shaping human physiology. Some researchers propose that the ability to travel long distances under varying environmental conditions gave Homo sapiens a unique advantage over other hominin species, though the exact balance between biological adaptation and cultural behavior remains debated. You feel this endurance in the rhythm of movement. It is not fast, but it is persistent. There is no sense of rushing. Instead, there is continuity, as if stopping for too long would break something essential in the system of survival. The group pauses again, this time more deliberately. You look ahead and notice a subtle change in vegetation density. There are more scattered plants here, some of which appear to bear small edible parts. Someone moves forward to inspect them carefully. Food acquisition in this world is not guaranteed. It is always conditional. Every potential resource must be evaluated, tested through knowledge, passed down through experience. You observe how selection is slow, careful, almost cautious in its execution. A common finding in archaeological nutrition studies is that early human diets included a wide spectrum of plant species, many of which required processing to become digestible or safe. This implies not only knowledge of edible resources, but also knowledge of transformation techniques, even if those techniques were simple or rudimentary by modern standards. You notice how small items are gathered and placed into simple carrying bundles. There is no sense of accumulation beyond necessity. Everything collected has immediate purpose. Nothing is gathered for abstraction or surplus in the modern sense. A small detail often discussed in ethnographic comparisons is that knowledge of edible plants is frequently held collectively rather than individually, meaning that survival depends on shared memory across the group. Some anthropologists suggest that this distributed knowledge system may have origins in early human societies. Although direct archaeological confirmation is limited, you begin to see how intelligence here is not concentrated in one mind but spread across many. Each individual contributes a fragment of understanding, and together these fragments form a functional map of survival. The terrain becomes slightly rougher again as the group moves forward. Small stones scatter across the ground, and the soil becomes drier. The environment feels less predictable here, requiring more careful attention with each step. In studies of prehistoric mobility patterns, there is ongoing discussion about how early humans balanced exploration with caution. Some researchers argue that exploratory movement was essential for discovering new resources, while others emphasize the importance of risk minimization strategies that limited exposure to unknown environments. You notice that both tendencies exist here at once. The group explores, but never recklessly. They observe, but do not hesitate excessively. It is a constant calibration between curiosity and caution. A lesser-known observation from archaeological distribution data is that early human sites often cluster around ecotones, areas where two ecological zones meet. These regions provide access to multiple resource types, making them particularly advantageous for mobile groups. However, some scholars caution that site clustering may also reflect preservation bias rather than actual behavioral preference. You walk through a patch where the ground briefly softens underfoot. It holds moisture from earlier rainfall. The smell is slightly richer here, carrying hints of organic decay and fresh growth. It feels like a place where life is constantly renewing itself in small cycles. The group slows again. There's a brief moment of stillness. Someone looks toward a distant cluster of movement in vegetation. You follow their gaze, but it is unclear at first what is there. In early human survival contexts, such moments of ambiguity were critical. Misinterpretation could lead to wasted energy or exposure to danger. One line of research suggests that heightened sensitivity to environmental uncertainty may have shaped cognitive development in Homo sapiens, particularly in relation to pattern recognition and risk assessment. The movement resolves into small animals passing through the grass, nothing threatening, just life continuing independently of the group. The tension relaxes slightly, but awareness remains. You realize how much of existence here is built around interpretation. Every moment is a question, every answer is temporary. Nothing is fully resolved. A small but interesting detail in archaeological studies is that where patterns on hunting and cutting tools often show signs of repeated sharpening and reuse, suggesting that efficiency and conservation were critical aspects of material culture. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of long-term planning behavior, while others argue it reflects simple scarcity and necessity. The group resumes walking again, moving steadily across the open land. The sun continues its arc overhead, and shadows shorten further. The world feels stable in appearance, but internally it remains dynamic and uncertain. As you continue with them, you begin to understand something fundamental. The hardest part of being human here is not finding food or avoiding danger. It is maintaining constant interpretive awareness in a world that never stops offering ambiguous signals. The group moves forward, disappearing gradually into the textured landscape of late morning light. The group continues forward as the late morning settles into a steady, almost predictable rhythm of light. The sun is higher now, and its warmth spreads across the landscape in slow waves. Yet nothing about this world becomes truly predictable, even in brightness. Uncertainty remains the underlying condition of every step you take with them. The terrain begins to change again, subtly at first, then more clearly. The ground becomes slightly firmer, less damp, with patches of dry grass bending underfoot. Small insects move through the vegetation, and distant bird calls echo in irregular patterns. It feels like the world is waking fully. not just from night, but into a state of continuous activity. You walk alongside the group as they maintain their steady pace. There is no formal direction, yet everyone moves as if guided by something shared and unspoken. Movement here is not chaotic. It is coordinated through attention, memory, and constant environmental reading. Archaeological evidence from multiple Upper Paleolithic and early Homo sapiens sites suggests that fire use had already become widespread by this period. Although the consistency of control varied across regions, some researchers propose that fire was not just a survival tool, but also a central organizing feature of daily life, influencing social structure, diet, and even patterns of movement. Other interpretations suggest that early fire use may have been more opportunistic, dependent on natural occurrences rather than continuous human maintenance. You think back to the night before, to the small glowing embers, and how much of survival seemed to revolve around that fragile source of heat. Even now, in daylight, the absence of fire feels noticeable, as if a stabilizing force has temporarily been removed. A lesser-known detail in archaeological studies is that some sites show repeated evidence of controlled burning in the same locations, suggesting that early humans may have returned to familiar fire sites when conditions allowed. Some anthropologists interpret this as early spatial planning behavior, while others argue that it reflects environmental convenience rather than intentional site management. The group pauses briefly as they enter a slightly more open area where vegetation thins. You notice how attention sharpens again. Heads lift, eyes scan, even in daylight. Vigilance does not disappear, it simply shifts form. You crouch slightly as someone examines the ground ahead. There are faint disturbances in the soil, possibly recent animal movement. Nothing is certain. Interpretation remains the constant task here. One widely discussed finding in paleoecology is that early human foraging strategies were highly responsive to environmental variability. Rather than relying on a single food source, groups adapted to whatever was available locally, shifting dietary patterns in response to seasonal changes. This flexibility is considered one of the key factors in Homo sapiens' ability to expand across diverse ecosystems. You begin to see how this flexibility plays out in real time. The group does not commit to one direction or one goal. Instead, they continuously adjust based on subtle cues in the environment. A small detail often mentioned in ethnographic comparisons is that many traditional foraging societies organize knowledge about the environment in highly distributed ways. No single individual holds all information. Instead, expertise is shared across the group, creating a collective intelligence that emerges through interaction. You notice this here as well. One person seems more attentive to plant life, another focuses on ground patterns, another watches distant movement. Each contributes a different layer of awareness. The terrain becomes slightly uneven again, with shallow dips and scattered stones. Walking requires more attention. Every step is still simple, but never automatic. The body's always negotiating with the ground. In evolutionary anthropology, there is ongoing discussion about the role of endurance walking in shaping human cognition and physiology. Some researchers propose that long-distance mobility under variable conditions encouraged enhanced planning abilities, spatial memory, and social coordination. Others caution that such interpretations may overemphasize walking as a single driving factor among many environmental pressures. You feel this endurance in your own imagined movement with the group. There is no rush, no sprinting, only sustained progression, shaped by attention and adjustment. The sun continues to rise higher, and warmth increases gradually. It is not oppressive, but it becomes a constant presence. You notice how the group instinctively adjusts, seeking partial shade when available, shifting posture slightly to conserve energy. A mainstream archaeological observation is that early human skeletal remains show adaptations consistent with long-distance walking and running efficiency. These include changes in limb proportions and joint structures that suggest endurance movement played a significant role in daily survival activities. You glance at the group again, noticing how natural their movement appears within this landscape. There is no separation between body and environment. They're part of the terrain in motion. The group slows again as they approach a patch of vegetation that appears denser than surrounding areas. Some individuals begin to inspect it closely. You see careful selection of leaves and stems, evaluating which parts may be useful. Food gathering here is not a simple act. It is layered with knowledge, caution, and experience. Every choice carries potential risk and reward. A lesser-known detail from archaeological nutrition studies is that early human diets often required significant processing of plant materials to make them digestible or safe. This implies not only knowledge of edible species but also methods of preparation, even if those methods were simple in form. You observe how collected items are placed into small bundles. There is no surplus mindset. Everything is immediate, practical, and directly tied to survival needs. In some anthropological interpretations, knowledge of plant resources is thought to have been highly localized, meaning that groups carried detailed understanding of specific regions rather than generalized knowledge of all environments. Some researchers argue that this localization may have shaped early cognitive mapping abilities. You begin to sense how intelligence here is deeply connected to place. Knowing where you are is inseparable from knowing what you can eat, where you can rest, and how you can move. The group resumes walking, moving deeper into a mixed ecological zone where open ground and vegetation interweave. The landscape feels more complex here, offering both opportunity and uncertainty. One line of paleo-environmental research suggests that ecotonal regions, where different ecological zones overlap, were particularly important for early human survival due to their resource diversity. However, other researchers caution that this may reflect sampling bias in archaeological site preservation. You walk through this complexity, noticing how attention continuously shifts between near and far, ground and horizon. A faint movement in the distance draws collective attention again. The group slows, scanning carefully. For a moment, everything becomes still except for wind moving through grass. The movement resolves into small animals passing through the vegetation. There is no confrontation, only observation. Life continues independently, parallel to the group's journey. You feel how quickly tension rises and falls in this world. Nothing is dramatic, yet everything is significant. A small detail in archaeological tool analysis shows that early stone tools often display repeated sharpening patterns, indicating careful maintenance and long-term use. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of resource conservation strategies, while others suggest it reflects simple necessity due to limited raw material availability. The group continues forward once more, maintaining the steady rhythm across the land. The sun is now fully established overhead, and the world feels both open and demanding as you move with them. You begin to understand something subtle but essential. The hardest part of being human here is not any single environmental challenge. It is the constant need to interpret, adjust, and respond to a world that never becomes fully stable or fully known. The group disappears gradually into the bright expanse of late morning terrain. The sun has now climbed higher into the sky, and the landscape is fully awake in a way that feels almost overwhelming after the softness of night. Light reveals everything at once, every uneven patch of ground, every shifting blade of grass, every distant movement that might be animal, wind, or something in between. There is no longer any hiding in shadow. The world has become visually honest, but also more demanding. You continue walking with the group as they move deeper into this mixed terrain where open stretches alternate with scattered clusters of vegetation. The air is warmer now, carrying a dry edge that hints at the growing intensity of the day. You can feel how heat begins to influence behaviour subtly. Movements become slightly more measured, pauses slightly more frequent, as if the body itself is negotiating with rising temperature. Archaeological and environmental studies of early Homo sapiens suggest that daily activity patterns were strongly shaped by thermal conditions. In many regions, foraging and movement were concentrated in cooler hours of the morning and late afternoon, with midday often reserved for rest or reduced activity. Some researchers propose that this behavioural rhythm may have influenced long-term social organisation, while others argue that it was simply a direct response to physiological limits. You notice the group adjusting naturally without any discussion. They move through patches of partial shade when available, slowing slightly when the sun is most direct. There is an unspoken understanding that energy must be conserved. Nothing is wasted here, not movement, not attention, not time. A lesser-known observation from archaeological site analysis is that hearth remnants in some regions show evidence of daytime abandonment, suggesting that groups may have temporarily left central activity zones during hotter periods, returning later when conditions were more favourable. Some anthropologists interpret this as early spatial scheduling behaviour, though others emphasise environmental constraint as the primary driver. You feel the heat more clearly now on your skin, a steady pressure rather than a sudden force. It does not overwhelm, but it changes everything. Even breathing feels slightly different, slower, more deliberate. The group continues forward, but the pace is no longer uniform. It flexes gently with the terrain and the temperature. The ground becomes drier as you move further. Small cracks appear in the soil, and vegetation becomes more sparse in places. In other areas, clusters of plants still hold moisture, creating small pockets of life within a broader dry field. These contrasts shape movement. The group instinctively gravitates toward richer patches of land. One line of evidence in paleoecology suggests that early human foraging success was closely tied to environmental patchiness. Resource-rich microzones within broader landscapes likely played a critical role in sustaining mobile populations. Some researchers argue that this patchiness required advanced spatial memory, while others emphasize the role of social sharing in distributing environmental knowledge. You crouch slightly as someone examines a cluster of low plants. The inspection is slow, careful, almost ritual in its attention. Leaves are turned, stems checked, subtle cues evaluated, nothing is rushed. Selection here is not about abundance, it is about certainty. A small but recurring detail in ethnobotanical comparisons is that foraging knowledge is often highly specific to local ecologies, with individuals learning to identify edible and non-edible species through repeated exposure over time. Some anthropologists suggest that this type of learning may have shaped early human observational skills, though direct archaeological confirmation remains indirect. You continue walking as the group gathers a few small items. There is no sense of accumulation beyond necessity. Everything is tied to immediate use or short-term carrying capacity. The body itself becomes the storage system, limiting what can be taken and what must be left behind. The sun continues its rise, and shadows shorten further. The landscape feels more exposed now, less forgiving. Without shade, even stillness carries discomfort. You begin to understand why movement and rest are carefully balanced here. Too much of either can become costly. Comparative studies in human physiology suggest that endurance walking, combined with intermittent rest periods, may have been a critical adaptation in early Homo sapiens. This pattern allows heat dissipation while maintaining long-distance mobility, a combination that may have supported expansion into diverse and challenging environments. You notice how the group instinctively finds small opportunities for relief, a brief pause near a slight dip in terrain, a moment of stillness behind a cluster of shrubs. These are not formal rests. They are micro-adjustments, woven into movement itself. The environment ahead begins to shift again. The vegetation becomes slightly denser, and the ground shows signs of increased moisture. You sense a subtle change in attention within the group. Movement becomes more deliberate. Scanning becomes more frequent. Something about this area feels more promising. Archaeological distribution patterns often show that early human activity clusters around transitional ecological zones where multiple resource types overlap. These areas are particularly valuable for mobile foraging groups because they reduce the distance required to access different types of food sources. However, some researchers caution that preservation bias may overrepresent such zones in the archaeological record. You walk into this mixed environment, noticing how quickly perception adapts. Every detail becomes meaningful. A shift in grass color, a pattern in soil texture, a distant rustle. Nothing is ignored. The group slows again as someone spots movement in the vegetation ahead. The reaction is immediate but controlled. Bodies align slightly. Attention converges, but there is no panic, only focus. You follow their gaze and see small animals moving through the grass. Their motion is fluid and unbothered, entirely separate from the group's concerns. For a moment, both worlds exist in parallel, one observing, one simply living. In evolutionary anthropology, there is ongoing discussion about how early humans developed heightened sensitivity to motion detection. One interpretation suggests that this ability was crucial for both predator avoidance and prey tracking. Other researchers emphasize that such perceptual skills likely evolved gradually, through cumulative environmental pressures rather than sudden cognitive shifts. The group does not pursue. They simply observe for a moment before continuing forward. Not every encounter becomes action. In this world, restraint is as important as response. You begin to see how energy is managed in layers. Physical energy, attention, time, all are conserved carefully. Nothing is spent without consideration. Even curiosity is moderated by necessity. A small detail often noted in lithic studies is that early stone tools show signs of multifunctional use, suggesting that individuals adapted single tools for various tasks over time. This reflects a broader pattern of resource efficiency that extends across many aspects of early human life. The group resumes walking, maintaining its steady rhythm. The sun is now high, and the world feels fully illuminated. Yet instead of clarity bringing comfort, it brings exposure. Everything is visible, and therefore everything requires interpretation. As you continue with them, you realize that the hardest part of being human in this moment is not any single environmental condition. It is the continuous demand to stay mentally engaged with a world that never becomes simple, never becomes fully known, and never stops requiring attention. The group moves onward into the bright, textured expanse of midday. The sun now sits high overhead, and the landscape beneath it feels exposed in a way that is almost overwhelming after the softer transitions of earlier hours. Shadows have shortened into thin markings beneath rocks and bodies, and the heat spreads evenly across the open terrain. The group slows slightly, not from exhaustion alone, but from the steady pressure of temperature that builds quietly with every passing moment. You walk with them into this brighter, harsher part of the day where movement becomes more economical. Every step is measured, every pause is intentional. The environment is no longer just something to read, it is something to manage. Archaeological reconstructions of early Homo sapiens behavior suggest that midday hours in many regions were often marked by reduced activity, especially in open landscapes where shade was limited. One interpretation in environmental anthropology proposes that this rhythm of movement was not just a response to heat, but also a way of balancing energy expenditure across the day. Other researchers emphasize that this pattern likely varied significantly depending on geography and seasonal conditions. You notice how the group naturally seeks out small patches of shade whenever possible, a cluster of taller vegetation, a slight depression in the ground, the narrow shadow of a rock formation. These brief moments of relief become essential points of rest, even if they last only a short time. A lesser-known detail from paleoenvironmental studies is that plant distribution in many prehistoric landscapes created natural micro-refuges, small shaded zones where temperature and moisture differed slightly from surrounding areas. These microenvironments may have played a crucial role in supporting both human and animal activity during peak heat periods. You crouch briefly as the group pauses again. Someone wipes sweat from their forehead, adjusting posture to reduce exposure. The body here is always negotiating with the environment, constantly adapting to external pressure. Nothing is static. One line of evidence in evolutionary physiology suggests that humans developed a unique combination of thermoregulatory traits that allowed sustained activity under heat stress. These include efficient sweating mechanisms and endurance-based locomotion. Some researchers argue that these adaptations were essential in enabling long-distance travel across hot savanna environments, while others caution that multiple evolutionary pressures likely contributed. You continue walking, feeling how the heat now influences not just comfort but decision-making. The group moves slightly slower, but also more deliberately. Attention narrows in some ways while expanding in others. The immediate environment becomes more important than distant horizons. A small but recurring observation in archaeological site analysis is that areas with intermittent shade and water access tend to show higher densities of tool fragments and occupation traces. Some researchers interpret this as evidence that early humans structured their daily movement around environmental comfort zones, though others suggest that these patterns may reflect preservation conditions rather than behavioral preference. You notice how the group begins to spread out slightly in search of better footing and more comfortable ground. There is still cohesion, but it is looser now, shaped by individual micro-decisions within a shared direction. The landscape ahead becomes more varied again. Low vegetation gives way to scattered clusters of shrubs and uneven patches of soil that vary in colour and texture. These subtle differences often indicate underlying changes in moisture or soil composition, something that early humans likely learned to read over time through repeated exposure. In paleoanthropological discussions, there is ongoing interest in how environmental literacy developed in early human groups. One perspective suggests that long-term survival required highly detailed understanding of local ecosystems, including seasonal cycles, plant behavior, and animal movement. Other researchers emphasize that much of this knowledge was likely experiential and transmitted through observation rather than formal teaching. You crouch again as someone inspects a small patch of ground. The attention is focused, precise. There are faint traces here, possibly from small animals or recent movement through the area. Nothing definitive, only patterns that suggest possibilities. A lesser-known detail from experimental archaeology is that replication studies of prehistoric foraging often show how difficult it is to distinguish meaningful environmental signals from random variation. This suggests that early humans had to develop strong pattern recognition skills simply to avoid misinterpretation of their surroundings. You realize how much mental effort is involved in what appears to be simple walking. Every step is accompanied by assessment. Every sound carries potential meaning. Even silence must be interpreted. The group moves forward again, entering a slightly more open stretch where wind becomes more noticeable. It passes through the vegetation in steady waves, offering brief moments of cooling relief. You feel how even small changes in air movement become significant under heat stress. One interpretation in human evolutionary studies proposes that endurance walking combined with heat adaptation may have influenced not only physical development, but also cognitive evolution. The ability to sustain attention over long periods while managing environmental stresses is seen by some researchers as a key factor in human adaptability. Other scholars argue that cognitive development cannot be isolated from broader ecological and social factors. You continue with them as the terrain shifts again. The ground becomes slightly firmer, less varied, more consistent in texture. This creates a different rhythm of movement, smoother but still cautious. Stability in terrain does not reduce attention, it simply changes its focus. A small detail often noted in lithic distribution studies is that tool production debris is frequently found in areas that combine resource availability with temporary rest conditions. Some researchers suggest that tool making may have been integrated into rest periods during the hottest parts of the day, while others argue that production occurred opportunistically whenever conditions allowed. You notice how the group pauses again, this time under a thin line of scattered shade. It is not full shelter, but it offers enough relief to reduce the intensity of heat. Bodies settle briefly, not fully resting, but easing into a slower state. Breathing becomes more noticeable here, not laboured, but deliberate. You begin to understand how even respiration is shaped by environment. Nothing in this world is independent of external conditions. The sun remains high, but there is a subtle shift beginning in its angle, almost imperceptible. Time continues forward without pause, even when survival feels like it is balancing in place. A lesser-known observation in archaeological climate studies is that many early human occupation sites show seasonal layering patterns, suggesting repeated return during specific environmental windows. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of long-term ecological planning, while others see it as simple following of resource cycles. You remain with the group as they prepare to move again. The brief rest is ending, not because conditions have improved, but because movement itself is part of managing those conditions as they rise and continue forward. You begin to see something more clearly. The hardest part of being human here is not simply enduring heat or searching for shade. It is maintaining constant awareness while the environment continuously shifts between comfort and strain without ever fully stabilizing. The group moves onward into the bright, unrelenting middle of the day. The middle of the day stretches on, and the landscape begins to feel less like a place you are passing through and more like a condition you are continuously enduring. The sun remains high, steady, and indifferent, pouring light across the ground with a kind of quiet persistence that flattens contrast and sharpens heat. Shadows are minimal now, reduced to thin outlines that cling tightly to rocks and bodies. You continue walking with the group, though the rhythm has shifted again. Movement is still present, but it is no longer constant. It unfolds in segments, a few steps forward, a pause in partial shade, a slow scan of the terrain, then movement again. The world has become a sequence of adjustments rather than a continuous journey. Archaeological interpretations of early Homo sapiens mobility patterns suggest that daily activity was often structured around environmental constraints rather than fixed schedules, in hot climates especially. Midday periods appear to correlate with reduced movement intensity and multiple site reconstructions. One perspective in environmental archaeology proposes that this pattern reflects a deeply embedded behavioral adaptation to thermal stress, while another view emphasizes the variability of local conditions that would have prevented any uniform global rhythm. You notice how the group now prioritizes even the smallest sources of relief. A narrow strip of shade from a bent tree, the cooler air near a shallow depression in the soil, the brief shelter of taller grass. These micro-adjustments define survival here more than any single large decision. A lesser-known detail from geoarchaeological studies is that subtle changes in sediment composition can reveal patterns of repeated short-term occupation, suggesting that early humans may have paused frequently within broader travel routes rather than moving continuously across long distances. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of highly segmented daily movement strategies. You crouch briefly as someone examines the ground again. There are faint disturbances here. possibly indicating small animal movement or shifting soil conditions. Nothing definitive, only signs that require interpretation. In this environment, certainty is rare. Most understanding comes from probability and experience rather than direct clarity. One line of evidence in human evolutionary physiology suggests that endurance walking combined with heat tolerance required not only physical adaptation, but also behavioral regulation. This includes pacing strategies, hydration awareness, and movement timing. Some researchers argue that these combined traits created a unique ecological flexibility in Homo sapiens compared to other hominin species, while others emphasize the importance of cultural learning in shaping these behaviors. You feel the heat more intensely now as the group moves across a more exposed section of land. The ground reflects warmth upward, creating a layered sensation of temperature from both above and below. It is not painful, but it is persistent, shaping every decision about speed and direction. A small but recurring observation in archaeological site distributions is that human activity tends to cluster around transitional microenvironments, even during harsh climatic periods. These include areas near scattered vegetation, intermittent shade, or subtle variations in terrain that offer slight thermal advantages. Some scholars suggest that these patterns indicate an advanced sensitivity to environmental gradients, though others caution that preservation bias may influence interpretations. You continue forward, noticing how attention narrows under heat stress. The group focuses more on immediate surroundings and less on distant landscape features. The horizon is still visible, but it feels less relevant than the next few steps. The soundscape also changes slightly. Wind moves through dry grass with a faint rustling rhythm, and distant bird calls become more sporadic. Even sound feels diluted under the intensity of light and heat. Everything is present, but softened at the edges. In paleoanthropological discussions, there is ongoing exploration of how sensory perception may have been shaped by environmental pressures. One hypothesis suggests that early humans developed heightened sensitivity to subtle environmental changes such as temperature shifts, wind direction, and distant movement, all of which would have been critical for survival in variable climates. Other researchers argue that such traits are difficult to isolate and may overlap significantly with general primate sensory abilities. You notice the group pausing again near a small cluster of vegetation. The shade here is thin but meaningful. Bodies shift toward it instinctively. There's no need for instruction. Comfort is distributed through awareness rather than command. A lesser-known detail from experimental archaeology is that replicated foraging simulations often show how quickly energy expenditure rises under heat stress, even during low-intensity movement. This suggests that midday travel in hot environments would have required careful balancing of effort and recovery, reinforcing the importance of intermittent rest. You observe how the group uses these brief pauses not just for physical relief, but also for environmental reassessment. Each stop becomes a moment of recalibration. Direction, distance, and resource evaluation are all subtly updated. The train ahead shifts again. The soil becomes slightly lighter in colour, and patches of vegetation thin out. This creates a more uniform visual field, which in turn reduces environmental contrast. It becomes harder to distinguish subtle changes in the ground at a glance, requiring closer inspection. One interpretation in landscape archaeology suggests that early humans developed strong attentional switching abilities, allowing them to move between broad environmental scanning and focused local inspection. Some researchers propose that this cognitive flexibility was essential for survival in dynamic ecosystems, while others emphasize the role of learned behavior passed through social observation. You feel this switching happen constantly within the group. One moment attention is wide, scanning the horizon. The next, it narrows to a single patch of ground or plant cluster. There is no fixed mode, only continuous adjustment. A small detail often noted in lithic studies is that tool distribution patterns sometimes indicate brief, repeated stops rather than long-term settlements. This has led some researchers to propose that early human landscapes were structured around networks of transient activity points. Though others argue that such interpretations may oversimplify complex mobility behaviours, you continue walking through the heat, noticing how the body itself becomes a measuring instrument. Fatigue, thirst, and temperature are constantly monitored through sensation rather than conscious analysis. Survival depends on interpreting these internal signals accurately. The group slows again as the terrain becomes slightly uneven. Small dips in the ground create pockets where air feels marginally cooler. These micro differences become important enough to influence movement paths. In evolutionary studies, there is ongoing discussion about how early humans integrated environmental and bodily information into decision-making processes. One perspective suggests that cognition in this context was deeply embodied, meaning that perception, movement, and physiological state were tightly interconnected. Other researchers caution against overgeneralizing this integration across all early populations. You crouch briefly as someone inspects another patch of ground. The attention is precise, careful, nothing is assumed, everything is evaluated in context. A lesser-known observation from ethnographic comparisons is that many modern foraging societies still demonstrate highly refined environmental reading skills, particularly in relation to heat, water availability, and resource timing. Some anthropologists suggest that these patterns may reflect deep evolutionary continuity, though others emphasize cultural adaptation as the primary driver. You begin to sense the subtle persistence of movement even in rest. The group never fully stops, even in pauses. There is scanning, adjustment, and preparation for the next segment of travel. The sun remains strong overhead, but there is a faint shift beginning in its position, almost imperceptible at first. Time continues forward, slowly transitioning toward the later part of the day. As you walk with them, you understand more clearly now that the hardest part of being human here is not simply enduring environmental pressure. It is sustaining continuous attention within a world that demands constant recalibration of both body and perception. The group continues forward through the bright, textured expanse of midday terrain. The sun has begun its long, slow descent from its highest point. Though the change is almost imperceptible at first, the heat remains strong, pressing evenly across the landscape, but something subtle has shifted in the rhythm of the day. Shadows begin to regain a hint of length, stretching faintly from rocks and uneven ground. The group notices this shift not through language, but through behavior. Movement becomes slightly more fluid again, less segmented than during the harshest midday hours. You continue walking with them across terrain that now feels slightly more forgiving. The air is still warm, but it no longer carries the same sharp intensity. Even the ground seems less harsh underfoot, as if the world itself is easing out of its most demanding state. Yet survival here never truly relaxes, it only changes form. Archaeological interpretations of early Homo sapiens activity patterns suggest that late afternoon periods often marked a return to increased mobility after midday heat reduction. One perspective in environmental anthropology proposes that this rhythm reflects a fine-tuned adaptation to diurnal temperature cycles, while another view emphasizes that these patterns likely varied widely depending on geography, season, and resource distribution. You notice the group adjusting almost immediately. Steps lengthen slightly, attention shifts outward again, scanning more of the surrounding terrain rather than focusing only on immediate ground conditions. The world feels more open, more usable. A lesser-known detail from paleo-environmental reconstructions is that many prehistoric landscapes show evidence of seasonal shifts in resource accessibility, meaning that the same region could vary significantly in productivity depending on rainfall, temperature, and animal movement patterns. Some researchers argue that this variability required early humans to develop highly flexible planning strategies, while others suggest that movement was more reactive than planned. You walk through a patch where vegetation becomes slightly denser again. Small shrubs cluster together, creating intermittent pockets of shade and cooler air. These micro-environments feel almost noticeable in their contrast, offering brief relief from the broader warmth of the day. One line of evidence in evolutionary anthropology suggests that human endurance walking was not only a survival mechanism, but also a behavioral framework that structured how early humans interacted with their environment. Some researchers propose that the combination of long-distance movement and constant environmental monitoring may have contributed to advanced spatial reasoning abilities. Others caution that cognitive evolution likely resulted from multiple overlapping pressures rather than a single behavioral factor. You crouch briefly as the group slows near a disturbed patch of soil. There are faint signs here, possibly indicating recent animal movement. Nothing is certain, only interpretation based on subtle environmental cues. A small but recurring observation in archaeological site analysis is that tool production debris is often found in proximity to areas with mixed ecological characteristics. This suggests that early humans may have preferred locations where multiple resource types were accessible within short distances. However, some scholars caution that such patterns may also reflect preservation biases or sampling limitations. You continue forward as the group resumes movement. The pace is more comfortable now, though still deliberate. Heat has not disappeared, but it has become manageable. The body is no longer under constant strain, only steady awareness. The soundscape of the environment begins to change slightly as well. Wind moves more freely through vegetation, creating layered textures of sound. Distant calls of birds become more frequent. Even silence feels less dense than it did earlier in the day. In paleoanthropological discussions, there is ongoing interest in how sensory perception may have been shaped by environmental variability. One hypothesis suggests that early humans developed heightened sensitivity to changes in light, sound, and temperature as a survival advantage in unpredictable landscapes. Other researchers argue that these sensory traits likely evolved gradually in response to multiple ecological pressures rather than a single dominant factor. You feel this sensitivity in the group's behavior. Attention is never fixed. It flows continuously between near and far, ground and horizon, movement and stillness. The terrain ahead begins to shift again, becoming slightly more structured. Natural lines in the landscape guide movement without imposing it. A shallow curve in the ground directs the group's path. A cluster of vegetation suggests a more sheltered route. These subtle cues shape direction without requiring explicit decision-making. A lesser-known detail from geoarchaeological studies is that early human occupation sites often show alignment with natural landscape features such as water flow patterns, elevation gradients, and vegetation boundaries. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of intuitive landscape integration, while others suggest that such alignment is simply the result of following resource availability. You walk through a narrow stretch where shade briefly returns. The temperature drops slightly here, and the difference is immediately noticeable. The group slows for a moment, not stopping fully, but easing into the cooler air. One interpretation in human behavioral ecology suggests that early humans likely developed fine-grained awareness of thermal variation at microscales. This would include recognizing subtle differences in shade, wind exposure, and ground temperature. Other researchers emphasize that such awareness may not have been consciously analytical, but instead embodied through repeated experience. You notice how naturally the group adapts to these small environmental variations. No one announces changes, no one directs movement. Everything is coordinated through shared perception. A small detail often mentioned in lithic research is that tool use wear patterns indicate repeated maintenance and reuse, suggesting that objects were not discarded lightly. This reflects a broader cultural pattern of resource efficiency that extends beyond tools to include movement, time, and energy. The group continues onward, entering a slightly more open section of terrain where visibility expands again. The sun remains present but less harsh than before. Shadows are longer now, more distinct, marking the slow transition toward later afternoon. You begin to feel how the entire rhythm of the day is structured around environmental constraints. Morning brings exploration, midday brings reduction, late afternoon brings renewed movement. These patterns are not imposed but discovered through necessity. A lesser-known observation from archaeological climate studies is that repeated human occupation layers in some regions correspond closely with seasonal environmental cycles, suggesting long-term adaptation to predictable changes in resource availability. Some researchers argue that this reflects early forms of ecological planning, while others caution that human behavior likely remained flexible and opportunistic. You continue walking as the group moves steadily across the landscape. The fatigue of midday is fading, replaced by a more sustainable rhythm. The body feels less constrained, more capable of extended movement again. In evolutionary anthropology, there is ongoing discussion about how diurnal activity patterns influence human development. Some researchers propose that synchronization with environmental cycles may have shaped not only physical endurance, but also cognitive timing and social coordination. Others emphasize that such patterns are difficult to generalize across different regions and climates. You notice how the group begins to subtly orient toward areas that appear more promising for later activity. This is not a conscious plan. It is a gradual shift in attention as the day moves forward. The landscape ahead opens into a broad stretch where vegetation and open ground intermingle. The light is softer now, less intense, casting a more balanced illumination across the terrain. Everything feels slightly more stable, though never fully certain, as you move with them. You understand that the hardest part of being human here is not any single environmental challenge. It is the continuous adjustment to a world that changes its demands throughout the day, requiring constant recalibration of body, attention, and movement. The group continues forward into the widening light of late afternoon. The late afternoon light settles more gently across the landscape now, no longer as harsh as midday, but still strong enough to define every ridge, every patch of grass, every uneven shift in the ground. The world feels more legible again, as if it is offering clearer instructions after the long strain of heat. The group continues forward, and you notice how their movement subtly changes once more. It is no longer segmented or cautious in the same way. It becomes smoother, more continuous, as if the body is remembering how to travel with less resistance. You walk with them across terrain that gradually becomes more varied. Small clusters of vegetation return, and with them, slight variations in shade and temperature. The air carries a softer tone now, still warm but less pressing. It feels like the environment is slowly releasing its grip on the day. Archaeological and environmental reconstructions of early Homo sapiens behavior suggest that late afternoon periods often represented a second productive window for activity. After the thermal peak of midday, groups would resume movement, foraging, and sometimes longer distance travel. One interpretation in human behavioral ecology proposes that this pattern reflects an adaptive response to predictable daily temperature cycles, while other perspectives emphasize regional variability and ecological uncertainty. You notice how the group naturally becomes more exploratory again. Attention shifts outward. The scanning of the environment becomes more frequent and less constrained. Movement is no longer just about conserving energy. It becomes about opportunity once more. A lesser-known detail from archaeological site distribution studies is that many early human activity zones show repeated short-term occupation layers concentrated in late-day contexts, suggesting that certain resources may have been more actively exploited during cooler hours. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of time-structured foraging behavior, while others caution that preservation conditions may distort perceived patterns of activity timing. You crouch briefly as someone examines a patch of ground where vegetation appears slightly disturbed. The inspection is careful, almost habitual. Nothing is assumed. Every trace is evaluated in relation to context, memory, and environmental understanding. One line of evidence in evolutionary anthropology suggests that early Homo sapiens developed highly flexible foraging strategies that allowed rapid adjustment to changing environmental conditions throughout the day. This flexibility is considered one of the key factors in their ability to occupy diverse habitats across continents. Other researchers emphasize that such flexibility likely evolved gradually through cumulative behavioral adaptation rather than sudden cognitive transformation. You continue walking as the terrain shifts again, becoming slightly more open in places and more enclosed in others. This patchwork of environments creates a rhythm of movement that feels both dynamic and stable at the same time. The group adjusts naturally to these transitions without breaking cohesion. The soundscape becomes more noticeable again as the heat diminishes. Wind moves through vegetation with greater presence. Bird activity increases. Small rustlings in grass become easier to distinguish. The world feels more layered, more populated with subtle signals. In paleo-environmental research, there is ongoing discussion about how sensory awareness in early humans may have been tuned to detect fine-grained ecological changes. One hypothesis suggests that survival depended heavily on the ability to notice small variations in sound, movement, and light. Other researchers argue that such sensitivity likely emerged from general primate perceptual abilities enhanced by environmental pressure rather than uniquely human adaptation alone. You feel this attentiveness in the group's behavior. There's a constant shift between scanning the horizon and focusing on immediate surroundings. Nothing remains fixed in attention for long. A small but recurring observation in archaeological lithic studies is that tool production sites often appear in areas where resource gathering and rest overlap, suggesting that early humans may have combined work and recovery periods rather than separating them strictly. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of integrated daily activity cycles, while others suggest that it reflects opportunistic use of convenient spaces. You walk through a slightly elevated section of ground where the view expands again. From here, the landscape appears broader, more open, and easier to read. The group slows briefly, not to stop but to reassess direction. One interpretation in landscape archaeology suggests that early human movement was guided by a combination of environmental cues and accumulated spatial memory. Rather than following fixed paths, groups likely relied on learned knowledge of terrain patterns, resource locations, and seasonal changes. Other perspectives emphasize that such movement may have been more exploratory and less structured than some models propose. You notice how the group seems to orient subtly toward areas that appear richer in vegetation. This is not a conscious decision spoken aloud. It emerges through shared perception. Someone adjusts direction slightly, and others follow without hesitation. The ground becomes softer in places, indicating higher moisture content. Vegetation grows more densely in these areas, creating small corridors of shade and cooler air. These microenvironments become increasingly important as the afternoon continues. A lesser-known detail from geoarchaeological analysis is that early human occupation sites often align with ecotonal boundaries, where multiple ecological systems intersect. These zones provide diverse resources within relatively small areas, making them highly attractive for mobile foraging groups. However, some researchers caution that such patterns may reflect preservation bias or sampling concentration rather than behavioral preference. You continue moving as the group enters one of these mixed zones. The temperature difference is noticeable immediately. Even small shifts in shade and vegetation density change the felt experience of the environment. You crouch again as someone examines a cluster of plants. The selection process is slow, deliberate. Leaves are inspected, stems assessed, and only certain parts are gathered. There is no rush. Every action is tied to knowledge accumulated through experience. In ethnobotanical comparisons, it is often noted that traditional foraging knowledge systems are highly detailed and localized. Individuals learn to recognize specific plants and their uses through long-term exposure and repeated practice. Some anthropologists suggest that similar knowledge structures may have existed in prehistoric populations, though direct evidence remains indirect. You begin to see how intelligence in this environment is distributed across both individuals and time. Knowledge is not stored in a single place. It is carried in memory, observation, and shared practice. The group continues forward, gathering small items along the way. There is no accumulation beyond immediate need. Everything collected has purpose tied to short-term survival or preparation for later use. The sun continues its gradual descent, and shadows lengthen again. The quality of light changes subtly, becoming warmer, softer, more angled. The landscape begins to feel less exposed and more dimensional. In evolutionary studies, there is ongoing discussion about how diurnal cycles influenced early human behavioral organization. Some researchers propose that predictable environmental rhythms helped shape cognitive timing mechanisms and social coordination patterns. Others emphasize that human behavior likely remained highly flexible and context-dependent rather than strictly cyclical. You feel this flexibility in the group's continuous adjustment. There is no rigid structure, only responsiveness. A small detail often noted in archaeological toolware analysis is that repeated maintenance of stone tools indicates long-term planning and conservation behavior. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of foresight in resource management, while others argue that it reflects necessity-driven reuse rather than abstract planning. You continue walking as the group moves deeper into the late afternoon landscape. The world feels more balanced now, less extreme than earlier in the day, yet it remains unpredictable, constantly requiring attention. As you move with them, you begin to understand something increasingly clear. The hardest part of being human here is not surviving any single moment of heat, hunger, or uncertainty. It is maintaining continuous adaptation to a world that shifts its demands throughout every phase of the day. The group continues forward into the softening light of late afternoon. The late afternoon continues to unfold, and the light begins to soften in a way that changes everything without announcing itself. The sun is lower now, no longer directly overhead, and the shadows begin to stretch outward again, slowly reclaiming space across the ground. The heat is still present, but it has lost its sharp edge. What remains is a steady warmth that feels easier to move through, easier to think within. You walk with the group across a landscape that now feels more forgiving than it did earlier in the day. The terrain is familiar in its variability. Open stretches alternate with clusters of vegetation, and the ground shifts between firm soil and softer patches that hint at hidden moisture. Movement becomes smoother again, less segmented, more continuous. Archaeological and environmental analyses of early Homo sapiens activity patterns indicate that late afternoon often marked a return to extended mobility after the constraints of midday heat. One interpretation in human behavioral ecology suggests that this period allowed groups to maximize resource acquisition while balancing thermal stress. Other perspectives emphasize that these rhythms were highly dependent on regional climate conditions and could vary significantly across populations. You notice how the group subtly reorients itself. Attention spreads outward again. The scanning of the environment becomes more active, less restricted. There is a sense that the day is entering a more productive phase once more, even if no one expresses it verbally. Findings from paleo-environmental site distributions reveal that early human occupation often concentrated in ecotonal regions, where multiple ecological zones intersect. These areas tend to offer a wide variety of resources within relatively small distances, making them especially valuable for mobile foraging groups. However, some researchers caution that such patterns may reflect preservation bias rather than deliberate behavioral preference. You crouch briefly as someone examines a patch of ground where vegetation appears slightly disturbed. The inspection is slow and deliberate. Nothing is assumed. Every detail is evaluated in relation to experience and environmental context. One line of interpretation in evolutionary anthropology proposes that early Homo sapiens developed highly flexible foraging strategies that allowed them to adapt quickly to changing environmental conditions. This adaptability is often considered a key factor in their successful expansion across diverse habitats. Other analyses emphasize that flexibility likely emerged from a combination of ecological necessity and cumulative cultural learning over many generations. You continue walking as the group adjusts its spacing slightly. There is still cohesion, but it is looser now. Individuals move with more autonomy while remaining connected through subtle shared awareness. The soundscape becomes richer again as the heat diminishes. Wind moves through vegetation with more presence. Bird calls increase in frequency. Small movements in the grass become easier to distinguish. The environment feels more layered, as if it is slowly returning to a more active state after the compression of midday. Research in sensory ecology suggests that early humans likely relied on continuous integration of multiple sensory inputs, including visual, auditory, and tactile information, to interpret environmental changes. Some scholars propose that this heightened sensitivity was essential for survival in dynamic ecosystems, while others argue that such abilities may not have been significantly different from those of other primates, but were applied in more complex behavioral contexts. You feel this attentiveness in the group's movement. There is no fixed pattern of focus. Attention flows between distant scanning and close inspection of the ground, between horizon awareness and immediate physical detail. A detail often observed in lithic assemblages is that stone tool production debris frequently appears in areas associated with short-term occupation and resource processing. This suggests that early humans may have integrated tool-making into broader daily activity cycles, rather than treating it as a separate specialized task. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of highly flexible behavioral organization, while others caution against overgeneralizing site-specific findings. You walk through a slightly more open section of terrain where visibility increases again. The landscape extends outward in soft undulations, revealing a wider view of vegetation clusters, subtle elevation changes, and faint animal movement in the distance. The group slows briefly, not in hesitation, but in reassessment. Direction is not fixed here. It emerges from continuous observation and shared understanding of environmental cues. One perspective in landscape archaeology suggests that early human movement was guided by a combination of spatial memory and real-time environmental reading, rather than following predetermined routes. Groups likely adjusted paths dynamically in response to resource availability and terrain conditions. Other interpretations emphasize the role of social learning and inherited knowledge in shaping movement patterns. You notice how the group subtly aligns itself toward areas where vegetation appears denser. These shifts are not spoken, they are felt collectively. A shared sense of where possibilities might exist guides movement without explicit instruction. The ground becomes slightly softer again, indicating higher moisture levels beneath the surface. Vegetation grows more closely packed in these areas, creating pockets of cooler air that contrast with surrounding open ground. Geoarchaeological findings suggest that early human activity often concentrated in transitional ecological zones, where different resource systems overlap. These ecotonal regions provide access to diverse food sources and environmental conditions within relatively compact areas. However, some researchers emphasize that such clustering may also reflect preservation processes rather than behavioral preference. You continue forward, noticing how each environmental change influences movement rhythm. The group does not stop for long. It adjusts, integrates, and continues. A small inspection occurs again as someone bends toward a cluster of plants. The evaluation is careful, almost habitual. Leaves are examined, stems tested visually, and only certain parts are selected. Knowledge here is practical and immediate, grounded in repeated exposure to similar environments. Ethnobotanical comparisons indicate that foraging knowledge in many traditional societies is highly localized, with individuals developing detailed understanding of specific plant communities within their environment. Some anthropologists suggest that similar localized knowledge systems likely existed in prehistoric populations, although direct evidence remains indirect and reconstructed through inference. You begin to see how intelligence in this world is distributed not only among individuals but across time and experience. No single person holds complete knowledge. Instead, understanding emerges collectively through shared attention and accumulated memory. The sun continues its descent, and the quality of light shifts again. Shadows lengthen further, becoming more distinct and textured. The world feels less flattened now, more dimensional. Depth returns to the landscape in subtle ways. Evolutionary studies of human behavior suggest that diurnal activity patterns may have influenced both physiological and cognitive development. Some researchers propose that synchronization with environmental cycles supported endurance-based mobility and social coordination. Other perspectives emphasize the complexity of multiple interacting factors in shaping human evolution. You feel this complexity in the way the group moves. There is no single rule guiding behavior. Instead, there is constant adjustment, continuous recalibration in response to shifting conditions. A detail often noted in archaeological studies of stone tools is that repeated sharpening and reuse patterns indicate careful management of resources over time. This suggests a behavioral emphasis on conservation and efficiency. Though some researchers interpret these patterns as simply reflecting scarcity rather than deliberate planning, you walk with a group as they continue deeper into the late afternoon terrain. The environment feels more balanced now, less extreme than earlier in the day, yet still unpredictable and requiring attention. As movement continues, a clearer understanding begins to form. The hardest part of being human here is not any single environmental challenge. It is the need to remain continuously adaptive within a world that never stabilizes long enough to become fully known. The group moves onward into the widening light of late afternoon. The late afternoon light continues its slow transformation, becoming softer and more angled as the sun lowers further toward the horizon. The landscape responds to this shift immediately. Shadows stretch longer across the uneven ground, and textures that were flattened at midday begin to reappear. The world feels more dimensional again, as if depth itself has returned after being temporarily compressed by heat and brightness. You walk with the group across a broad stretch of mixed terrain where vegetation clusters appear more frequently. The air is noticeably cooler now, though still warm enough to carry the memory of the day's intensity. Movement becomes more fluid again, less interrupted by pauses, though still carefully measured. The rhythm of survival has shifted once more into a more productive phase. Archaeological interpretations of early Homo sapiens mobility suggest that late afternoon often served as a key window for intensified activity, including foraging, travel, and resource collection. One perspective in human behavioral ecology proposes that this pattern reflects an adaptation to daily thermal cycles, while other analyses emphasize that such rhythms likely varied depending on regional environments and seasonal conditions. You notice how the group's attention expands outward again. The scanning of the environment becomes more active and less constrained. There is a sense of renewed engagement with the landscape, as if the world is offering opportunities again after the restraint of midday. Findings from site distribution studies indicate that early human occupation is often associated with ecotonal zones, where multiple ecological systems intersect. These transitional areas provide access to diverse resources within relatively short distances. However, some researchers caution that such patterns may be influenced by preservation bias and uneven archaeological sampling rather than direct behavioral preference. You continue walking as the terrain becomes slightly more varied. Small rises and dips in the ground create subtle changes in perspective. Vegetation shifts in density, forming natural pathways that guide movement without requiring explicit direction. A lesser-known detail from paleo-environmental reconstructions is that early human groups may have repeatedly used familiar environmental corridors over long periods, creating informal networks of movement through landscapes. Some interpretations suggest that these patterns reflect accumulated spatial knowledge, while others emphasize that they may have emerged organically from repeated resource-following behavior. You crouch briefly as someone inspects a patch of ground. The attention is focused and deliberate. There are faint signs of disturbance in the soil, possibly indicating recent animal movement. Nothing is confirmed. Everything remains in the realm of interpretation and probability. One line of evidence in evolutionary anthropology suggests that early Homo sapiens developed advanced environmental sensitivity, allowing them to detect subtle cues in terrain, vegetation, and animal behavior. Other perspectives argue that this sensitivity may not have been unique, but rather an extension of general primate perceptual abilities applied within more complex social contexts. You continue forward as the group adjusts its spacing again. There is still cohesion, but it is more flexible now. Individuals move with greater autonomy while remaining connected through shared environmental awareness. This soundscape of the environment becomes richer as the heat continues to decline. Wind moves through grass and shrubs with greater presence. Bird activity increases. Distant rustlings become more distinct. The landscape feels more alive, more populated with subtle movement. Research in sensory ecology suggests that early humans likely relied on continuous integration of multiple sensory inputs to interpret environmental conditions. Visual cues, auditory signals, and even subtle changes in air movement would have contributed to decision-making. Some researchers propose that this heightened sensitivity played a crucial role in survival within dynamic ecosystems, while others emphasize the difficulty of separating human sensory evolution from broader primate traits. You feel this attentiveness in the group's behavior. There is no fixed focus. Attention shifts constantly between near and far, between ground-level details and distant horizon scanning. A small detail often noted in lithic assemblage studies is that stone tool production debris frequently appears in short-term occupation sites, suggesting that tool-making was integrated into daily activity rather than separated into specialized production phases. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of highly flexible behavioral organization, while others caution that such interpretations may oversimplify complex archaeological patterns. You walk through a slightly more open stretch of terrain where visibility increases again. The landscape unfolds in soft layers of vegetation, shallow depressions, and distant movement. Everything feels more readable now, but also more dynamic. The group slows briefly, not to stop but to reassess direction. Movement is never fixed here. It is constantly adjusted based on environmental cues that shift from moment to moment. One interpretation in landscape archaeology suggests that early human movement was guided by a combination of spatial memory and real-time environmental reading. Rather than following fixed routes, groups likely adapted dynamically to changing conditions and resource availability. Other perspectives emphasize the importance of social learning and shared knowledge in shaping movement patterns across generations. You notice how the group subtly orients toward areas where vegetation appears denser. These adjustments are not spoken aloud. They emerge through shared perception and collective intuition. The ground becomes slightly softer again, indicating higher moisture content. Vegetation grows more closely together, creating small pockets of cooler air that contrast with surrounding exposed areas. Geoarchaeological findings suggest that early human activity often concentrated in ecotonal zones, where different ecological systems overlap. These regions offer access to diverse resources within relatively compact spaces, making them especially valuable for mobile foraging groups. However, some researchers emphasize that such clustering may also reflect preservation bias in the archaeological record. You continue walking as the group moves through this mixed environment. The pace remains steady, but attention is heightened. Every change in vegetation or ground texture is noted, evaluated, and integrated into movement decisions. A brief inspection occurs again as someone kneels near a cluster of plants. The evaluation is careful and systematic. Leaves are examined visually, stems assessed, and only certain parts are selected. Knowledge here is practical, accumulated through repeated exposure and shared experience. Ethnobotanical comparisons indicate that foraging knowledge in many traditional societies is highly localized, with individuals developing detailed understanding of specific ecological niches over time. Some anthropologists suggest that similar localized knowledge systems likely existed in prehistoric populations, though direct evidence remains indirect and reconstructed through inference. You begin to understand how intelligence in this environment is distributed across both individuals and experience. No single person holds complete understanding. Instead, knowledge emerges collectively through observation, memory, and shared attention. The sun continues its descent, and the quality of light shifts once again. Shadows lengthen further, becoming more distinct and textured. The world regains depth in a way that feels almost gentle compared to the intensity of midday. Evolutionary research on human behavior suggests that diurnal activity patterns may have influenced both physiological adaptation and cognitive development. Some perspectives propose that synchronization with environmental cycles supported endurance, mobility, and social coordination. Other interpretations emphasize the complexity of multiple interacting pressures in shaping human evolution. You feel this complexity in the group's movement. There is no single guiding principle. Instead, there is continuous adjustment, a constant negotiation between environment, body, and shared awareness. A detail often observed in archaeological tool studies is that repeated maintenance and reuse of stone tools indicate careful resource management strategies. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of foresight and planning, while others suggest it reflects necessity-driven conservation in resource-limited environments. You continue walking as the group moves deeper into the late afternoon landscape. The environment feels more balanced now, less extreme than earlier in the day, but still requiring constant attention. As movement continues, a clearer understanding begins to form. The hardest part of being human here is not any single environmental challenge. It is the continuous need to remain adaptive within a world that never stabilizes long enough to become fully known. The group moves onward into the softening light of late afternoon. The late afternoon begins to soften further as the sun lowers its angle, and the landscape changes with it in subtle but continuous ways. Light no longer presses directly downward. Instead, it arrives at an angle that gives shape back to the world. Every ridge, every patch of vegetation, every shallow depression in the ground becomes more readable again. The heat has eased, but it has not disappeared completely. It lingers in the soil and in the air like a memory that has not yet faded. You walk with a group through this shifting environment, noticing how movement becomes more relaxed without ever becoming careless. The rhythm of walking steadies again. It is no longer interrupted by frequent pauses for heat management, but it still carries constant attention. Survival here is never fully passive. Even ease requires awareness. Archaeological interpretations of early Homo sapiens behavior suggest that late afternoon periods often represented one of the most active phases of the daily cycle. One perspective in environmental anthropology proposes that this window allowed groups to maximize foraging efficiency after midday heat stress had passed. Other analyses emphasize that these patterns likely varied significantly depending on ecological conditions, resource distribution, and seasonal cycles. You begin to notice how the group's attention expands outward again. The scanning of the environment becomes more dynamic. Heads turn slightly more often. Movement is less constrained, more exploratory. It feels as if the world is opening again after a period of compression. Findings from paleoecological site studies indicate that early human occupation frequently clustered in ecotonal regions, where multiple environmental systems overlap. These areas tend to provide a diverse range of resources within relatively short distances, including plant materials, water access points, and animal movement corridors. However, some researchers caution that the apparent importance of these zones may be influenced by preservation bias in the archaeological record. You crouch briefly as someone examines a patch of ground. The inspection is careful and methodical. There are faint traces of disturbance, possibly indicating recent movement of small animals. Nothing is confirmed, only interpreted. The environment never gives certainty. It only provides patterns that must be read. One line of interpretation in evolutionary anthropology suggests that early Homo sapiens developed highly flexible perceptual systems that allowed them to detect subtle environmental changes. Other perspectives argue that such sensitivity may not be uniquely human, but rather an extension of broader primate awareness, refined through behavioral complexity. You continue walking as the group adjusts its spacing slightly. There is still cohesion, but it is looser now. Individuals move with greater independence while remaining connected through shared awareness of the environment. The soundscape becomes more pronounced as the heat continues to decline. Wind moves through vegetation more visibly. Bird activity increases. Small rustling movements in grass and shrubs become easier to distinguish. The environment feels more layered, more active. Research in sensory ecology suggests that early humans likely relied on continuous integration of multiple sensory inputs, including visual, auditory, and tactile information, to interpret environmental conditions. Some scholars propose that this multisensory awareness was essential for survival in variable ecosystems, while others emphasize the difficulty of distinguishing uniquely human sensory traits from those of other primates. You feel this attentiveness in the group's behavior. There is no fixed focus. Attention flows constantly between near and far, between ground-level detail and distant horizon scanning. A detail often observed in lithic studies is that stone tool production debris frequently appears in short-term occupation sites, suggesting that toolmaking was integrated into daily activity rather than separated into specialized production spaces. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of highly flexible behavioral organization, while others caution against drawing overly uniform conclusions from site-specific patterns. You walk through a slightly more open section of terrain where visibility increases again. The landscape unfolds in soft layers of vegetation, shallow slopes, and distant movement. Everything feels more legible, but also more dynamic and alive. The group slows briefly, not to stop but to reassess direction. Movement is never fixed here. It is continuously adjusted based on environmental reading and shared perception. One interpretation in landscape archaeology suggests that early human movement was guided by a combination of spatial memory and real-time environmental cues, rather than following predetermined routes. Groups likely adapted dynamically to changing conditions and resource availability. Other perspectives emphasize the importance of social learning and cumulative cultural knowledge in shaping movement across generations. You notice how the group subtly orients toward areas where vegetation appears denser. These adjustments are not spoken. They emerge through shared perception and collective recognition of opportunity. The ground becomes slightly softer again, indicating higher moisture content beneath the surface. Vegetation grows more closely together in patches, creating pockets of cooler air that contrast with exposed areas. These micro differences in temperature and texture become meaningful in shaping movement. Geoarchaeological findings suggest that early human activity often concentrated in ecotonal zones, where different ecological systems intersect. These regions provide access to a wide range of resources within compact spatial ranges, making them highly valuable for mobile foraging groups. However, some researchers emphasize that such clustering may also reflect uneven preservation conditions in the archaeological record. You continue walking as the group moves deeper into this mixed environment. The pace remains steady, but attention is heightened. Every variation in vegetation, soil, or sound is noted and integrated into movement decisions. A brief pause occurs again as someone kneels near a cluster of plants. The evaluation is slow and precise. Leaves are examined visually, stems assessed carefully, and only certain parts are selected. Knowledge here is practical and embodied, built through repeated exposure and shared experience rather than formal instruction. Ethnobotanical comparisons indicate that foraging knowledge in many traditional societies is highly localized, with individuals developing detailed understanding of specific ecological niches over time. Some anthropologists suggest that similar localized knowledge systems likely existed in prehistoric populations, though direct evidence remains indirect and reconstructed through inference. You begin to see how intelligence in this environment is distributed across individuals, experiences, and time. No single person holds complete knowledge. Instead, understanding emerges collectively through observation, memory, and continuous interaction with the landscape. The sun continues its descent, and the quality of light shifts again. Shadows lengthen further, becoming more defined and textured. The world regains depth, and the landscape feels more structured after the flattened intensity of midday. Evolutionary research on human behavior suggests that diurnal activity patterns may have influenced both physiological adaptation and cognitive organization. Some perspectives propose that synchronization with environmental cycles supported endurance mobility and social coordination. Other interpretations emphasize the complexity of interacting ecological and biological pressures shaping human evolution. You feel this complexity in the group's movement. There is no single governing principle. Instead, there is continuous adaptation, a constant negotiation between environment, body, and shared perception. A detail often noted in archaeological tool analysis is that repeated maintenance and reuse of stone tools indicate careful resource management strategies. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of foresight and planning, while others suggest it reflects necessity-driven conservation in resource-limited environments. You continue walking as the group moves deeper into the late afternoon landscape. The environment feels more balanced now, less extreme than earlier in the day, yet still requiring continuous attention. As movement continues, a clearer understanding begins to form. The hardest part of being human here is not any single environmental challenge. It is the continuous need to remain adaptive within a world that never stabilizes long enough to become fully known. The group moves onward into the softening light of late afternoon. The late afternoon light now carries a noticeably warmer tone, as if the day is gently preparing itself for transition. Shadows stretch longer across the ground, no longer tight and compressed, but extended and expressive. The landscape feels more open again, yet also more intimate, as details return to view after the harsh flattening of midday brightness. You walk with the group through this softened world, and their movement reflects the change immediately. It is steadier now, less segmented, more continuous. Archaeological and behavioral reconstructions of early Homo sapiens suggest that this stage of the day often represented a peak period for flexible activity. One interpretation in environmental anthropology proposes that reduced thermal stress allowed for increased movement efficiency, while other analyses emphasize that such patterns were likely highly variable depending on geography, season, and resource availability. You notice how attention within the group expands outward again. The scanning of the environment becomes more fluid, less constrained by immediate physical strain. There is a subtle sense of readiness returning, as if the landscape is once again offering possibilities rather than demands. Findings from paleoecological studies indicate that early human activity is frequently associated with ecotonal environments where different ecological systems intersect. These transitional zones provide access to diverse resources within relatively short distances, including water sources, edible plants, and animal movement corridors. Some researchers caution that the apparent importance of these zones may be influenced by preservation bias or uneven archaeological sampling, while others argue that their significance is strongly supported by spatial clustering of artifacts. You crouch briefly as someone examines a patch of ground. The inspection is slow and deliberate. There are faint disturbances in the soil, subtle enough that they could indicate recent movement of small animals or simply natural environmental variation. Nothing is certain. Everything requires interpretation based on accumulated experience and context. One perspective in evolutionary anthropology suggests that early Homo sapiens developed a form of heightened environmental sensitivity, allowing them to detect small changes in terrain, vegetation, and movement patterns. Other interpretations emphasize that such perceptual abilities may not be uniquely human, but instead represent an expansion of general primate awareness, shaped by complex social and ecological demands. You continue walking as the group adjusts its spacing again. Cohesion remains, but it is no longer rigid. Individuals move with a greater degree of autonomy while still maintaining a shared sense of direction and environmental awareness. This soundscape becomes richer as the heat continues to fade. Wind moves through vegetation with greater presence, creating layered patterns of sound. Bird activity increases noticeably. Distant rustlings in grass and shrubs become easier to distinguish. The environment feels more populated with subtle life. Research in sensory ecology suggests that early humans likely relied on continuous integration of multiple sensory inputs to interpret their surroundings. Visual cues, auditory signals, and even subtle tactile feedback from wind and ground contact may have contributed to survival decisions. Some scholars propose that this multisensory awareness was a key adaptive advantage in dynamic ecosystems, while others caution that similar traits exist broadly among primates and should not be overinterpreted as uniquely human. You feel this attentiveness in the group's behavior. There's no fixed focus of perception. Attention shifts constantly between near and far, between ground inspection and horizon scanning, between movement and stillness. A detail frequently observed in lithic assemblage studies is that stone tool production debris often appears in contexts associated with short-term occupation, suggesting that tool making was integrated into broader daily routines rather than separated into specialized production phases. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of highly flexible behavioral organization, while others emphasize the limitations of interpreting activity patterns from fragmented archaeological remains. You walk through a slightly more open stretch of terrain where visibility increases again. The landscape unfolds in gentle layers of vegetation, shallow depressions, and distant movement. Everything feels more readable now, but also more active, as if the world itself has regained complexity after the compression of midday heat. The group slows briefly, not to stop, but to reassess direction. Movement is never fixed in this environment. It is continuously adjusted in response to environmental cues and shared perception. One interpretation in landscape archaeology suggests that early human movement was guided by a combination of spatial memory and real-time environmental reading. Rather than following fixed paths, groups likely adapted dynamically to shifting conditions and resource availability. Other perspectives emphasize the importance of cumulative cultural knowledge passed through observation and shared experience across generations. You notice how the group subtly orients toward areas where vegetation appears denser. These shifts are not communicated verbally. They emerge through collective awareness and shared recognition of environmental potential. The ground becomes slightly softer again, indicating higher moisture content beneath the surface. Vegetation grows more closely together in clusters, creating pockets of cooler air that contrast with surrounding exposed areas. These micro-variations become increasingly important in shaping movement decisions. Geoarchaeological findings suggest that early human activity often concentrated in ecotonal zones, where different ecological systems overlap. These regions provide access to a wide variety of resources within relatively compact areas, making them highly valuable for mobile foraging groups. However, some researchers emphasize that such clustering may also reflect preservation biases in the archaeological record. Rather than direct behavioral preference, you continue walking as the group moves deeper into this mixed ecological environment. The pace remains steady, but attention is heightened. Every change in vegetation, soil texture, or sound pattern is noticed and integrated into movement decisions. A brief pause occurs again as someone kneels near a cluster of plants. The evaluation is slow and careful. Leaves are examined visually, stems assessed with attention to detail, and only certain parts are selected for gathering. Knowledge here is practical and embodied, accumulated through repeated exposure and shared experience rather than formal instruction. Ethnobotanical comparisons indicate that foraging knowledge in many traditional societies is highly localized, with individuals developing detailed understanding of specific ecological niches over time. Some anthropologists suggest that similar localized knowledge systems likely existed in prehistoric populations, though direct evidence remains indirect and reconstructed through comparative inference. You begin to see how intelligence in this environment is distributed across individuals, experience, and time. No single person holds complete knowledge. Instead, understanding emerges collectively through observation, memory, and continuous interaction with the landscape. The sun continues its descent, and the quality of light shifts once more. Shadows lengthen further, becoming more defined and textured. The world regains depth and structure after the flattened intensity of midday illumination. Evolutionary research on human behavior suggests that diurnal activity patterns may have influenced both physiological adaptation and cognitive organization. Some perspectives propose that synchronization with environmental cycles supported endurance, mobility, and social coordination, while other interpretations emphasize the complexity of interacting ecological and biological pressures shaping human evolution over long timescales. You feel this complexity in the group's movement. There is no single governing principle. Instead, there is continuous adaptation, a constant negotiation between environment, body, and collective awareness. A detail often noted in archaeological tool analysis is that repeated maintenance and reuse of stone tools indicates careful resource management strategies. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of foresight and planning, while others suggest it reflects necessity-driven conservation within resource-limited environments. You continue walking as the group moves deeper into the late afternoon landscape. The environment feels more balanced now, less extreme than earlier in the day, yet still requiring continuous attention and adjustment. As movement continues, a clearer understanding begins to form. The hardest part of being human here is not any single environmental challenge. It is the continuous need to remain adaptive within a world that never stabilizes long enough to become fully known. The group moves onward into the softening light of late afternoon. The late afternoon has now fully matured into its final stretch, and the light has changed in a way that is subtle but unmistakable. The sun is lower, its glow warmer and more angled, casting long shadows that stretch across the landscape like quiet indicators of time passing. The air has softened noticeably. The harsh pressure of midday is gone, replaced by a calmer atmosphere that still carries warmth, but no longer demands constant resistance from the body. You walk with the group through this transformed environment, and there is a sense that something about the day is beginning to resolve. Movement is no longer fragmented or tightly managed. It flows more naturally now, shaped by experience accumulated over the hours. The group does not rush, but it no longer hesitates either. It moves with continuity, as if the world has finally become cooperative after a long negotiation. Archaeological and environmental reconstructions of early Homo sapiens behavior suggest that late afternoon often served as a key transitional phase in the daily cycle, where energy levels stabilized after midday heat stress and before the uncertainties of night. One interpretation in behavioral ecology proposes that this period may have been critical for final resource gathering and positioning before evening rest. Other analyses emphasize that such patterns likely varied significantly depending on climate, geography, and seasonal resource distribution. You notice how attention within the group begins to shift again. It is no longer focused primarily on immediate survival pressures. Instead, it expands outward in a more reflective way, as if the landscape itself is being taken in more fully. The scanning of the environment becomes slower but more intentional, less reactive and more observational. Findings from paleo-environmental site distributions indicate that early human activity often concentrated in ecotonal regions, where multiple ecological systems overlap. These areas provide a diverse range of resources within relatively compact spatial zones, making them especially valuable for mobile foraging groups. Some researchers caution that the apparent importance of these zones may be influenced by preservation biases or sampling limitations, while others argue that spatial clustering patterns strongly support their behavioral significance. You crouch briefly as someone examines a patch of ground. The inspection is unhurried. There are faint traces of disturbance, possibly indicating recent movement of small animals or natural environmental shifts. Nothing is confirmed, only interpreted through accumulated knowledge and experience. One perspective in evolutionary anthropology suggests that early Homo sapiens developed a deeply integrated form of environmental awareness, in which perception, memory, and movement functioned as a continuous system. Other interpretations emphasize that such abilities likely emerged from broader primate sensory capabilities, refined through complex social and ecological interaction. You continue walking as the group adjusts its formation slightly. Cohesion remains, but it is now more relaxed. Individuals move with greater independence while maintaining shared orientation and awareness of surroundings. The soundscape becomes more pronounced as the heat continues to decline. Wind moves through vegetation with greater clarity. Bird activity increases again. Subtle rustling in grass and shrubs becomes more distinct. The environment feels more layered, as if it is revealing itself in greater detail as the day progresses. Research in sensory ecology suggests that early humans likely relied on continuous multisensory integration to interpret environmental conditions. Visual cues, auditory signals, and tactile sensations all contributed to survival decisions. Some scholars propose that this heightened environmental awareness was a key adaptive advantage, while others argue that similar perceptual abilities exist widely across primates and should not be considered uniquely human without caution. You feel this attentiveness in the group's behavior. Attention flows continuously between near and distant perception, between immediate ground-level detail and broader landscape awareness. A detail frequently observed in lithic assemblage studies is that stone tool production debris often appears in short-term occupation contexts, suggesting that tool-making was integrated into daily survival routines rather than separated into specialized activity phases. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of highly flexible behavioral organization, while others emphasize the interpretive limits of incomplete archaeological records. You walk through a slightly more open section of terrain where visibility increases again. The landscape unfolds in gentle layers of vegetation, shallow contours, and distant movement. Everything feels more legible, yet also more active, as if life within the environment has become more visible again. The group slows briefly, not to stop, but to reassess direction. Movement here is never fixed. It is continuously adjusted in response to environmental cues and shared perception. One interpretation in landscape archaeology suggests that early human movement was guided by a combination of spatial memory and real-time environmental reading. Rather than following fixed routes, groups likely adapted dynamically to changing conditions and resource availability. Other perspectives emphasize the importance of cumulative cultural knowledge passed through observation and shared experience over generations. You notice how the group subtly orients toward areas where vegetation appears denser. These adjustments are not spoken. They emerge through shared perception and collective recognition of environmental potential. The ground becomes slightly softer again, indicating higher moisture content beneath the surface. Vegetation grows more closely together in clusters, creating small pockets of cooler air that contrast with surrounding exposed ground. These micro-variations begin to influence movement decisions more noticeably. Geoarchaeological findings suggest that early human activity often concentrated in ecotonal zones where different ecological systems intersect. These regions provide access to diverse resources within relatively compact areas, making them highly valuable for mobile foraging groups. However, some researchers emphasize that such clustering may also reflect preservation biases in the archaeological record. You continue walking as the group moves deeper into this mixed ecological environment. The pace remains steady, but attention is heightened. Every variation in vegetation, soil texture, and sound is noticed and incorporated into movement. A brief pause occurs again as someone kneels near a cluster of plants. The evaluation is slow and precise. Leaves are examined visually, stems assessed carefully, and only selected parts are gathered. Knowledge here is practical and embodied, developed through repeated exposure and shared experience rather than formal instruction. Ethnobotanical comparisons indicate that foraging knowledge in many traditional societies is highly localized, with individuals developing detailed understanding of specific ecological niches over time. Some anthropologists suggest that similar localized knowledge systems likely existed in prehistoric populations, though direct evidence remains indirect and reconstructed through comparative inference. You begin to see how intelligence in this environment is distributed across individuals, experience, and time. No single person holds complete knowledge. Instead, understanding emerges collectively through observation, memory, and continuous interaction with the landscape. The sun continues its descent, and the quality of light shifts again. Shadows lengthen further, becoming more defined and textured. The world regains depth and structure after the flattened intensity of midday illumination. Evolutionary research on human behavior suggests that diurnal activity patterns may have influenced both physiological adaptation and cognitive organization. Some perspectives propose that synchronization with environmental cycles supported endurance, mobility, and social coordination, while other interpretations emphasize the complexity of interacting ecological and biological pressures shaping human evolution over long time scales. You feel this complexity in the group's movement. There is no single governing principle. Instead, there is continuous adaptation, a constant negotiation between environment, body, and collective awareness. A detail often noted in archaeological tool analysis is that repeated maintenance and reuse of stone tools indicates careful resource management strategies. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of foresight and planning, while others suggest it reflects necessity-driven conservation within resource-limited environments. You continue walking as the group moves deeper into the late afternoon landscape. The environment feels more balanced now, less extreme than earlier in the day, yet still requiring continuous attention and adjustment. As movement continues, a clearer understanding begins to form. The hardest part of being human here is not any single environmental challenge. It is the continuous need to remain adaptive within a world that never stabilizes long enough to become fully known. The group moves onward into the softening light of late afternoon, and the day begins to feel as if it is gently preparing for its final transition. Sweet dreams.